let's rewind the clock to the 13th century. No phones, no plumbing, no oat milk lats, just wind, hooves, and the occasional flaming arrow. The Mongol Empire wasn't just big, it was absurdly big. Bigger than your cousin's ego after one gym session. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, stitched together by horseback, blood, and a postal system that somehow worked better than yours. This is the story of why you, dear listener, would absolutely not survive a single day in it. Before we start, if you enjoy these history narrations, please hit subscribe. And hey, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it over there? Now, let's begin. Welcome to the endless grasslands of the Mongol Empire, where the wind never stops and the horizon never ends. This was no place for the faint of heart, or the lactose intolerant. The steppe was a vast, rolling sea of grass, dotted with yurts, galloping horses, and the occasional pile of bones. Life here was harsh, fast, and mobile. You didn't settle. You moved. Constantly. Your house had wheels. Your bed was made of wool. Your neighbors were armed. And your breakfast might involve watching your uncle wrestle a goat. This was a world where survival meant knowing how to ride by age 4, shoot by age 6, and drink fermented horse milk without gagging by age 7. It was a world of horses, yurts, and iron discipline, under the shadow of Genghis Khan's banner. And when we say ride, we don't mean a gentle trot around the village square. We mean galloping across frozen rivers, dodging arrows, and possibly delivering a message 200 miles away before lunch. Mongol kids didn't get training wheels. They got saddles, stirrups, and a stern uncle yelling, "Faster!" while wolves watched from the hills. If you fell off your horse, you didn't cry. You got back on, or you got left behind. And if you got left behind, well, the steppe had plenty of bones already. Their homes were yurts, portable felt tents that could be packed up faster than a modern Airbnb. These weren't cozy cottages with scented candles. They were wind, battered, smoke-filled, and smelled like goat. But they were warm, mobile, and could be assembled in under an hour by a family of 5 and one very annoyed grandmother. Meals, mostly meat. Dried meat, boiled meat, meat in broth, meat with a side of more meat. Vegetables were a rumor. And to wash it all down, a rag, fermented mare's milk. Imagine yogurt, but angry. It was sour, fizzy, and had the alcohol content of a bad decision. But it kept you warm, gave you courage, and made you forget that your boots were made from the skin of your cousin's favorite ox. And then there was the discipline. Mongol society ran like a military camp, with a side of apocalypse prep. Orders were followed without question. If you deserted, you were executed. If you stole, you were executed. If you disrespected your commander, you were, well, you get the idea. Genghis Khan didn't build an empire by handing out participation trophies. He built it by turning nomads into a war machine that could ride 100 miles a day, shoot backwards at full gallop, and still have time to pillage a city before dinner. This wasn't a land of comfort. It was a land of survival, of grit, guts, and galloping. And if you couldn't keep up, the wind would erase your footprints before anyone remembered your name. They conquered half the known world, but it was no paradise for those living within it. Because when your empire stretches from Korea to Hungary, someone's always cold, hungry, or being trampled by a horse. The Mongol Empire was vast, absurdly vast. It swallowed cities, kingdoms, and entire cultures like a hungry steppe wolf. But while the maps looked impressive, life inside the empire wasn't exactly a spa retreat. Sure, the roads were safer than most of medieval Europe. Yes, the postal system was faster than your cousin replying to texts. But comfort? Stability. A day without someone shouting in Mongolian while galloping past you with a bow. Not so much. If you were a farmer in China, You might wake up one morning to find your village now belonged to a Khan you'd never heard of. Taxes doubled. Language changed. Your ox probably requisitioned. If you were a merchant in Persia, you might benefit from the Pax Mongolica, until a local governor decided your goods looked better in his tent. And if you were a soldier in the Mongol ranks, congratulations, you are now part of the most efficient, terrifying, and sleep-deprived war machine in history. The empire moved fast. Orders were barked, arrows flew, and cities fell before their defenders finished breakfast. But that speed came at a cost. Entire populations were relocated. Skilled artisans were kidnapped and shipped across continents like medieval Amazon Prime. If your city resisted, it was leveled. If it surrendered, it was taxed into oblivion. And if you were caught in between, well, let's just say the Mongols didn't do nuance. Even Mongols themselves weren't exactly living the dream. Constant campaigns meant constant movement. You might ride for weeks through snow, sand or swamp, eating dried meat and drinking whatever didn't kill you. Your yurt was cozy, sure, but only if you liked sharing it with your extended family, their goats, and the smell of last night's stew. And heaven help you if your horse got sick. No horse, no travel. No travel, no survival. The empire was efficient, brutal, and astonishingly well organized. But it was also exhausting. You were always moving, always watching. Always one bad decision away from being reassigned to the front lines, or worse, the latrine detail. Waking up in the yurt, cold air biting your lungs as you crawl from under rough felt blankets. There's no gentle sunrise or birdsong here. Just the sharp slap of steppe air slicing through the seams of your yurt, like it's trying to remind you who's boss. The felt blankets, stiff with age and goat hair, barely hold back the chill. You curl deeper into them, nose tucked under, but it's no use. The cold finds you. It always does. It creeps into your bones, your breath fogs in the air, and your toes start negotiating terms of surrender. Outside, the wind howls like it's auditioning for a horror story. Inside, it's not much better. The yurt creaks and groans, the wooden lattice frame flexing under the pressure of the elements. You can hear the horses snorting outside, their hooves crunching frost as they shift impatiently. Somewhere, someone's already up. Probably your grandmother, stoking the fire and muttering about lazy bones and weak lungs. You sit up, slowly, because Mongol beds aren't really beds. They're more like slightly less hard parts of the floor. Your back cracks like a frozen branch. Your breath fogs again. You pull on your deal. A thick robe-like coat that smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and whatever you spilled on it last week. It's warm, though, and in this world, warmth is currency. Your boots are stiff. Your fingers are numb. You fumble with the laces, cursing softly in a language that has at least 12 different words for wind and none for comfort. You step outside for a moment to relieve yourself, and the wind hits you like a slap from an angry yak. You rush back in, eyes watering, ears stinging, and suddenly the yurt feels like a luxury hotel, and then it hits you, the smell. The unmistakable, unforgettable, slightly traumatic aroma of breakfast in the Mongol Empire. A smoky yurt, filled with the smell of fermented mare's milk and boiled meat, because nothing says, good morning, like dairy that fights back and mutton that's been simmering since last Tuesday. The smoke hangs low, curling around your head like a lazy ghost that refuses to leave. It seeps into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your soul. The fire pit in the center of the yurt crackles with half-burnt dung, the only fuel for miles, and the pot above it bubbles ominously. Inside, chunks of meat that have been boiled, reboiled, and possibly reincarnated. It's not clear what animal it came from, but it definitely died confused. Then there's the erag. Fermented mare's milk, It sits in a leather sack near the door, gently sloshing with every gust of wind. It's sour, fizzy, and slightly alcoholic, like yogurt that's been left in the sun with a grudge. You're handed a bowl. You sip. It punches you in the throat and then hugs your stomach. You're not sure if you like it, but you're definitely awake now. Breakfast is served in silence, save for the occasional slurp or cough. Conversation is minimal, not because people aren't friendly, but because everyone's mouth is full of chewy meat and existential dread. You chew slowly, eyes watering from the smoke, trying not to think about the fact that this exact meal was probably served yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. The walls of the yurt are lined with saddles, tools, and bundles of wool. Everything has a place, and every place is full. There's no privacy, no corners to hide in, just layers of felt, the smell of livestock, and the constant awareness that someone is always watching you eat, sleep, or try to scratch discreetly. Small, cramped, and always filled with family members. Because in the Mongol Empire, personal space was a myth, and your cousin was probably sitting on your boots. The yurt wasn't just a home. It was a shared experience in claustrophobia. You didn't live in it so much as with it. Every inch was occupied by people, by tools, by livestock, by that one uncle who always snored like a dying ox. There were no bedrooms, no doors to slam, no, I need 5 minutes to myself. Privacy was a luxury reserved for emperors and people lost in snowstorms. You slept shoulder to shoulder with your siblings, your parents, your grandparents, and possibly a goat. The goat wasn't invited. It just wandered in one day and never left. You learned to sleep through snoring, coughing, and the occasional midnight wrestling match between your brothers over who stole whose blanket. Spoiler, it was always the goat. The yurt was organized, in theory. Men sat on one side, women on the other, and the sacred hearth in the center kept everything warm and smoky. But in practice, it was chaos. Someone was always stepping over someone else. Someone was always boiling something questionable. And someone was always telling you to move, because you were sitting on the sacred saddle again. Arguments were whispered, jokes were shouted, and secrets were impossible. If you sneezed, 5 people blessed you, 2 people scolded you, and 1 person handed you a suspicious root to chew on. You knew everyone's habits, smells, and dreams, because they talked in their sleep, and you were 2 inches from their face. And yet, despite the noise, the crowding, and the constant risk of being elbowed in the ribs by your grandmother, the yurt was home. It was warm. It was mobile. It was yours. And when the wind howled outside, when the steppe turned to ice or dust, you were grateful for every smoky, cramped, goat-scented inch of it. Stepping outside into icy winds or dry heat, depending on the season. Because the Mongol Empire didn't believe in mild weather or gentle mornings. The steppe didn't do comfortable. It did extremes. In winter, the cold slapped you awake before your eyes even opened. You'd step outside and immediately question your life choices as the wind knifed through your deal and tried to steal your soul through your nostrils. Your eyelashes froze together. Your breath turned to ice midair. Your horse looked at you like, really? We're doing this again. In summer, it was the opposite, but equally rude. The sun rose early and without mercy, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. The air shimmered with heat, and the only shade was under your horse, which was already annoyed with you for waking it up. You'd sweat through your clothes before breakfast, and by midday, you were one bad decision away from becoming a human raisin. There were no seasons of ease, just different flavors of discomfort. Spring brought mud and biting winds. Autumn brought dust storms and the creeping dread of winter. You didn't dress for fashion. You dressed for survival. Layers of wool, leather, and stubbornness. And even then, The weather still found a way to humble you. But Mongols didn't complain. Complaining didn't make the wind stop or the sun cool down. They adapted. They moved. They endured. Because the steppe didn't care about your feelings. It cared about whether you could keep up. A Mongol without a horse was nothing. You would ride for hours each day. Because in this empire, your legs were just decorative, unless they were gripping a saddle. From the moment you could walk, you were expected to ride. Mongol children learned to balance on horseback before they could properly pronounce. Genghis. Your first saddle was probably smaller than your dinner bowl, and your first fall was met not with sympathy, but with a shrug and a get back on. Riding wasn't a skill, it was a survival mechanism. You rode to herd, to hunt, to fight, to flirt. If you couldn't ride, you couldn't live. And you didn't just ride casually. You rode hard, hours at a time, across terrain that laughed in the face of roads, through snow, sand, mud, and rivers. You rode in the dark. You rode in storms. You rode while eating, while sleeping, while composing poetry about how much your butt hurt. Mongol riders could cover 100 miles in a day without breaking a sweat or a horse. And if one horse got tired, no problem. You had 5 more tied to your saddle, trotting along like backup dancers. The saddle was your throne. The reins were your lifeline. You could shoot a bow while galloping full speed, twist in the saddle to fire behind you, and still have time to insult your enemy's haircut. Mongol archers were terrifying not just because they were accurate, but because they were mobile. They didn't charge, they swarmed. Hit, vanish, hit again. Like angry bees with better aim. Even messengers were elite riders. The Yam system, Mongol Express Mail, relied on relay stations where fresh horses waited. A single rider could deliver a message across the empire faster than most medieval armies could pack their tents. And if you were that rider, you didn't stop. You didn't sleep. You just rode, swapped horses, and kept going until your legs forgot how to walk. Because in the Mongol Empire, walking was for prisoners or corpses. Horses were small, sturdy, and essential for survival and war. And if you ever dared insult one, you'd better hope it didn't understand Mongolian. These weren't your sleek, pampered stallions from medieval Europe. Mongol horses were short, shaggy, and built like tanks with hooves. They looked like someone crossed a pony with a woolly mammoth and gave it the attitude of a caffeine-fueled goat. But don't let their size fool you. These little beasts were the backbone of the empire. They could gallop for hours, survive on frozen grass, and find their way home in a blizzard. They were basically 4-legged survivalists with better instincts than most humans. Each Mongol warrior had a personal herd, 4 to 6 horses minimum. Why? Because one horse wasn't enough. You rotated them like socks. One for riding, one for resting, one for emergencies, and one just in case the others got cranky. This system meant Mongol armies could move faster and farther than anyone else. While European knights were still arguing about who packed the tent poles, the Mongols were already 200 miles away, sipping arag and planning their next siege. And the bond between rider and horse, sacred. You didn't just ride your horse. You lived with it. You drank its milk, used its dung for fuel, and occasionally whispered your deepest secrets into its mane. Mongol horses were trained to respond to voice commands, leg pressure, and probably telepathy. They could stop on a dime, pivot mid, gallop, and keep moving even if arrows were flying, and the world was on fire. They were also incredibly low maintenance. No fancy stables, no golden oats, no velvet blankets, just grass, water, and the occasional pat on the neck. They could sleep standing up, navigate rough terrain, and survive temperatures that would make a polar bear reconsider its life choices. And if you lost your horse, you were done. A Mongol without a horse was like a fish without water, or a bard without an audience. useless, sad, and probably eaten by wolves. So yes, they were small, but they were mighty. And if you ever dared to mock one, you'd better hope it didn't kick you into next week, or worse, tell its friends. Riding in rain, snow, wind, across vast plains with little water. Because in the Mongol Empire, the weather didn't care about your plans, and neither did your horse. You didn't get to check the forecast. The forecast was, yes, it will rain. Yes, it will snow. Yes. The wind will slap you sideways while your horse pretends not to notice. Mongol riders didn't wait for good weather. They rode through whatever the sky threw at them. Torrential downpours, keep riding. Blinding snow, squint harder. Dust storms, wrap your face and hope you don't inhale a lizard. The steppe was a land of extremes. One day you'd be riding through a frozen wasteland, your eyebrows crusted with ice, your breath forming icicles on your mustache. The next, you'd be crossing a sun-scorched plain where the only shade was under your horse. And your horse wasn't sharing. Water was scarce, mirages were common, and if you didn't know where the next stream was, you'd better hope your horse did. Mongol horses had a sixth sense for survival. You had a canteen and a prayer. Rain turned the ground into a soup of mud and regret. Your boots squelched, your saddle soaked through, and your deal clung to you like a wet sheep. Snow made everything slippery and slow, except for the wind, which somehow got faster. It howled across the plains like it had a personal vendetta against your ears. And wind on the steppe wasn't just wind. It was a full-body experience. It got in your clothes, your food, your soul. It could knock over a yurt and still have energy left to ruin your hairstyle. And through it all, you rode. Because stopping meant freezing, or starving, or being left behind. The Mongol army didn't wait for stragglers. If you fell behind, you became a cautionary tale told around the fire. Remember Batar? Didn't tie his saddle tight. Now he's part of the landscape. There were no rest stops. No inns. No, let's take 5. You ate in the saddle. Slept in the saddle. Probably dreamed in the saddle. You crossed rivers, mountains, deserts, and the occasional battlefield. All while trying not to fall off or freeze solid. And if you complained, the wind carried your whining away before anyone could hear it, or care. Sore muscles, chafing, and blisters were constant. Because when your entire life is spent in the saddle, your thighs develop a grudge, and your skin files a formal complaint. There was no such thing as comfortable riding gear. You wore what you had, thick wool, stiff leather, and the occasional fur lining if you were lucky, or rich. After hours of bouncing across the steppe, your legs felt like they'd been tenderized by an angry butcher. Your inner thighs, a battlefield of friction burns. Your backside, a tragic poem in 3 verses, numb, sore, and betrayed. And don't even think about padded saddles. Mongol saddles were built for function, not comfort. High wooden frames kept you locked in during combat, but they also ensured that every bump, jolt, and pothole in the earth was transmitted directly to your spine. After a full day's ride, you didn't dismount. You peeled yourself off the saddle like a regretful sticker. Blisters formed in places you didn't know could blister. Your hands, from gripping reins and bowstrings. Your feet, from boots that were more decorative than ergonomic. Your thighs, from the endless rub of fabric, sweat, and desperation. And there was no ointment, no soothing balm. Just grit, spit, and the occasional muttered curse at the sky. But you kept riding. Because stopping meant falling behind. And falling behind meant being left for wolves, raiders, or worse, your commander's disappointment. So you rode through the pain. You adjusted your posture. You stuffed wool in your boots. You learned to ignore the sting, the burn, the itch. Because in the Mongol Empire, comfort was a myth, and saddle sores were just part of the uniform. fermented mare's milk, arag, dried meat, animal fat, curdled milk. Because after a day like that, dinner wasn't about taste. It was about survival. You didn't eat to enjoy. You ate to not die. The menu was consistent, if not exactly thrilling: a bowl of something chewy, a cup of something sour, and a side of "don't ask what that is." Arag was the drink of choice, slightly alcoholic, aggressively tangy, and fizzy enough to make your eyebrows twitch. It was made by churning mare's milk in a leather sack until it fermented into something that tasted like yogurt with a grudge and kicked like a mule. It was nutritious, hydrating, and mildly intoxicating, perfect for forgetting that your dinner was mostly sinew and guesswork. The meat, dried into strips so tough you could use them to patch a saddle. You chewed it for hours, like a determined beaver gnawing through a fence post. It was salty, fibrous, and occasionally still had hair on it. If you were lucky, it had been boiled into a stew with enough fat to make your lips shine for days. If you were really lucky, it had been boiled long enough to be chewable. Animal fat was prized, not just for cooking, but for energy. You might get a lump of it in your bowl, floating like a greasy iceberg in a sea of broth. It was dense, rich, and made your stomach feel like it had been hugged by a bear. And then there was the curdled milk, crumbly, sour, and suspiciously squeaky when you bit into it. It was stored in sacks, aged like a fine cheese, and smelled like a foot that had seen things. There were no spices, no sauces, no garnish. Just calories, protein, and the occasional surprise texture. Meals were eaten quickly, quietly, and with the resigned expression of someone who knew this was also tomorrow's menu. You didn't complain. You couldn't afford to. Food was fuel, and fuel kept you in the saddle. Little to no vegetables or bread, stomach aches were common, because fiber was a fantasy, and digestion was a full contact sport. The Mongol diet was a war crime against the modern food pyramid. Vegetables were mythical creatures, spoken of in hushed tones, like unicorns or warm baths. Bread, that was for soft, sedentary civilizations with ovens and time. On the steppe, you ate what didn't run away fast enough and what didn't spoil in a saddlebag. That meant meat, fat, and dairy, often all at once, and often in forms that would make a nutritionist weep. Your intestines were on a constant roller coaster of confusion. One day it was boiled mutton. The next it was dried mutton. The day after that, surprise! It's mutton again! But this time aged in a leather pouch and served with a side of regret. Your stomach didn't digest so much as negotiate. It pleaded. It bargained. It occasionally staged a rebellion. Constipation was a lifestyle. Diarrhea was a plot twist. And the line between the two was as thin as your patience after a week of nothing but curdled milk and mystery meat. You didn't ask what part of the animal you were eating. You just hoped it wasn't looking back at you. And yet, somehow they thrived. Their bodies adapted. Their guts became ironclad fortresses of microbial resilience. Meanwhile, you, modern fiber-fed, probiotic, pampered you, would last about 3 meals before curling into a fetal position and whispering apologies to your colon. Meals were quick, often while riding, because when your empire moves at the speed of a galloping horse, lunch breaks are for the weak. There was no picnic blanket, no leisurely chewing, no, let's stop and digest. You ate in the saddle, reins in one hand, dried meat in the other, while your horse galloped like it was late for a wedding. Mongol warriors could unwrap a hunk of mutton, gnaw it mid-charge, and still have enough coordination left to shoot an arrow into someone's spleen. It was multitasking at its most terrifying. Food was stored in saddlebags, wrapped in leather or cloth, and aged by time, sweat, and the occasional hoofprint. If it was soft, you ate it. If it was crunchy, you hoped it was just overcooked and not a beetle. Meals were shared, but not in the romantic, pass the salt kind of way. More like, rip off a chunk and toss it before the wind steals it. And if you dropped your food, too bad. The steppe gods had claimed it. There were no forks, no napkins, no time. You learned to eat fast, chew hard, and swallow before your horse hit a pothole. And if you were lucky, you didn't choke on a tendon while dodging arrows. Because in the Mongol Empire, the only thing slower than a full meal was a dead man. Theft was punished by death. Because when your army shares everything but patience, stealing someone's goat was basically a declaration of war. In the Mongol Empire, stealing wasn't just frowned upon. It was a one-way ticket to the afterlife. Express delivery, no return policy. You could insult someone's mother, accidentally sit on their saddle, or even spill their erag and maybe, get away with a bruised ego and a black eye, but steal. Oh no, that was sacred territory. That was dig your own grave and lie in it territory. You see, Mongol life was built on trust. When you're galloping across the steppe with 5 horses, a sack of dried meat, and a bow that doubles as a dinner bell, you need to know your stuff is safe. There were no locks, no safes. No Find My Goat app. Your belongings were protected by one thing: the unspoken agreement that if you stole, you'd be executed so fast your soul wouldn't have time to pack. And it wasn't just about property. It was about survival. That goat you stole, it wasn't just a goat. It was milk, meat, warmth, and possibly someone's emotional support animal. That saddlebag of dried meat, that was a week's worth of calories, and the only thing standing between a warrior and a very dramatic fainting spell mid-battle. Stealing wasn't petty. It was sabotage. Punishment was swift and public. No long trials. No appeals. Just a quick judgment and a quicker sentence. Sometimes it was a blade. Sometimes a rope. Sometimes they just tied you to a wild horse and let fate decide. Mongol justice didn't mess around. It was less due process and more don't blink or you'll miss the execution. And the worst part, the social shame. You didn't just die. You died embarrassed. Your name became a cautionary tale. Children were told, eat your meat, or you'll end up like Boro the butter thief. Your ghost wasn't feared. It was mocked. You became the punchline of every campfire story. Remember that guy who stole a saddle and got launched into the stratosphere by a yak? Classic. So no one stole. Not because they were saints, but because they liked breathing. And because they knew that in a society where everyone shared everything, food, shelter, horses, lice, the one thing they didn't share was tolerance for thieves. Desertion or betrayal led to execution. Because if stealing a goat got you killed, imagine what happened if you ran off with secrets. Or worse, with someone's backup horse. In the Mongol Empire, loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival strategy. You could be the best archer in the horde, the fastest rider on the steppe, or the only guy who knew how to fix a broken stirrup with yak hair and optimism. But if you betrayed the kine, you were toast. Not metaphorical toast. Actual, possibly roasted, definitely headless toast. Desertion was seen as the ultimate betrayal. You weren't just quitting your job. You were abandoning your brothers, your horses, your ancestors, and probably your lunch. And Mongols didn't take kindly to that. If you ran off mid-campaign, you didn't get a stern letter or a dishonorable discharge. You got hunted down by your own comrades, who were very motivated to catch you. Because if they didn't, they might be punished too. And betrayal? Oh boy. If you sold secrets to the enemy, or even looked like you were thinking about it, you were done. Executed on the spot. No trial. No dramatic monologue. Just a quick, efficient goodbye. And a new vacancy in the yurt. The Mongols didn't do second chances when it came to loyalty. They barely did first chances. And heaven help you if you betrayed someone's trust and took their backup horse. That was like stealing their car, their bed, and their emotional support animal all at once. Mongol horses were sacred. They were family. They were transportation, food, and occasionally central heating. Taking someone's spare horse was like slapping their grandmother and then asking for a ride home. Punishments were creative too. You might be executed by arrow, sword, or being tied to wild horses and encouraged to reflect on your choices. Sometimes they'd make an example of you, parade your body through camp, hang your head from a pole, or just tell your story around the fire with extra dramatic flair. And that, children, is why you never lie to the Khan. So no, you didn't desert. You didn't betray. You didn't even think about it. Because in the Mongol Empire, loyalty wasn't optional. It was enforced with terrifying enthusiasm. Disobedience, even small, could cost you your life. Because when your boss is Genghis Khan, oops, my bad, doesn't cut it. This was not a workplace where you could sneak in late, blame traffic, and hope no one noticed. Genghis Khan didn't do warnings. He did consequences. Forgot to tie your horse properly. That's not a mistake. It's sabotage. Misheard an order. That's treason with extra steps. Looked at the Khan funny. Congratulations. You're now a cautionary tale told to new recruits. Orders were sacred. If your commander said, "Ride east," you didn't ask how far or why. You just rode until your horse started questioning your sanity. If you were told to wait, you waited. If you were told to charge, you charged. Even if the enemy looked like they'd eaten 3 other armies for breakfast. And if you hesitated, well, let's just say the Mongols had a very efficient HR department, and it involved swords. Even minor slip-ups could be fatal. Forgot to pass along a message. That could cost lives, and yours would be the first. Took a shortcut that wasn't approved. You might find yourself permanently reassigned to guarding the worms. The Mongol military didn't have room for improvisation, unless it was brilliant and successful. Otherwise, it was just disobedience with flair. And don't even think about arguing. There was no, "Can I speak to the Khan?" moment. You didn't get to explain your side. You didn't get a second chance. You got a very short ceremony, a very sharp blade, and a very quiet funeral, if anyone bothered. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was efficiency. The Mongol army was a machine, and every cog had to turn perfectly. One loose bolt, one lazy rider, one guy who decided to freestyle the battle plan, and the whole thing could fall apart. So they made sure it didn't. Through fear, through discipline, through the knowledge that your next breath depended entirely on your ability to follow orders, like your life depended on it. Because it did. Discipline was brutal, and fear kept the army functioning. Because when your empire is held together by hooves and arrows, there's no room for creative interpretation. The Mongol military didn't run on trust falls and motivational posters. It ran on precision, obedience, and the constant, looming awareness that if you messed up, someone would be wearing your ears as a necklace by sundown. Orders weren't suggestions. They were sacred scrolls of survival. You didn't interpret them. You didn't tweak them. You followed them like your life depended on it. Because it absolutely did. Let's say your commander told you to flank the enemy at dawn. You didn't ask, which flank? Or, is that dawn local time or steppe time? You just nodded, mounted up, and rode like the wind owed you money. If you got it wrong, well, the Mongols had a very efficient feedback system. It involved sharp objects and public demonstrations. And don't think you could hide behind a group mistake. The Mongols were big fans of collective punishment. If one guy in your unit disobeyed, everyone got punished. It was like the world's worst group project, where one lazy teammate didn't just tank your grade. They got you all executed. Nothing builds camaraderie like knowing your buddy's poor decision might get you decapitated before lunch. Training was relentless. Drills were constant. You practiced formations, signals, and synchronized riding until your horse knew the routine better than you did. And if you ever thought about freelancing, maybe trying a cool new maneuver you saw in a dream, don't. The Mongol army didn't reward creativity unless it came with a body count and a captured city. Otherwise, it was just insubordination with flair. Even off the battlefield, discipline ruled. You didn't wander off. You didn't get drunk and start a yurt fire. You didn't, accidentally, insult your superior's mustache. Every action had consequences, and those consequences usually involved a very serious man with a very sharp blade and very little patience. But here's the thing. It worked. The Mongol army was a finely tuned war machine, and fear was the oil that kept it running. Not fear of the enemy, fear of disappointing the Khan, fear of being the weak link, fear of becoming a cautionary tale told around the fire while someone roasted goat on the same spit they used to execute your predecessor. Learning to ride before you could walk. Because in the Mongol Empire, your first steps were probably taken in a saddle, and your first words were, "Hold on tight." Forget baby walkers and playpens. Mongol toddlers were introduced to the world by being plopped onto a horse and gently nudged into motion. If you could crawl, you could ride. If you could babble, you could shout, "Yah!" at a galloping pony. Mongol parents didn't wait for milestones. They galloped past them. Teething? Here, chew on this leather rein. Potty training. Just aim off the side of the horse and hope for the best. By the age of 3, most Mongol kids had stronger calves than modern gym rats. Their balance was impeccable. Their fear of falling? Non-existent. Why? Because falling meant you got laughed at by your grandmother, who could still ride backwards while knitting. And if you cried, you were handed a chunk of dried meat and told to toughen up. Mongol parenting was less gentle guidance and more survival boot camp with hugs. The horses weren't just transportation. They were babysitters, teachers, and occasionally jungle gyms. Kids played games on horseback, raced each other across the plains, and practiced mock battles with sticks and wildly exaggerated war cries. If you could stay on a galloping horse while dodging your cousin's flying elbow, you were ready for adulthood, or at least for breakfast. And the horses, patient, sturdy, and probably just as confused as the kids. They tolerated being climbed on, slid off of, and occasionally used as a nap spot. Mongol horses were the real MVPs. Calm under pressure, immune to chaos, and always ready to bolt at the exact moment you dropped your snack. By the time a Mongol child hit 7, they weren't just riding. They were living in the saddle. They could steer with their knees, nap while trotting, and probably parallel park a herd of goats. Riding wasn't a skill. It was a birthright, a rite of passage, a way of life. Practicing archery from horseback with short composite bows. Because once you've mastered riding, the next logical step is shooting arrows at full gallop while yelling something heroic, or at least trying not to hit your own horse. Mongol archery wasn't just a skill. It was a lifestyle, a martial art, and a terrifying flex. The bows were short, curved, and made of layered wood horn and sinew. Basically the medieval version of carbon fiber. These composite bows packed a punch, launching arrows with enough force to pierce armor, tents, and the occasional overconfident knight. And they were compact enough to use while riding a horse that was bouncing like a caffeinated trampoline. Training began young. Kids practiced on foot first, learning to draw with a thumb ring and release with precision. Then came the real challenge. Doing it all while bouncing around on a galloping horse that had opinions about your posture. You had to time your shot with the rhythm of the horse's stride, aiming between bounces like some kind of medieval sniper on a pogo stick. And it wasn't just forward shooting. Mongol warriors could twist in the saddle and fire backward while retreating, because nothing says psychological warfare like getting shot by someone who's riding away from you. They trained to shoot left, right behind, and probably upside down if the mood struck. Arrows were stored in quivers on both hips, allowing for rapid fire that turned the sky into a very pointy rainstorm. Accuracy was everything. You didn't just aim for the enemy. You aimed for the horse under the enemy. Take out the mount, and suddenly that armored knight was just a very shiny pedestrian. Mongol archers could hit targets at incredible distances, even while moving at full speed. It was like Drive, by archery, but with more fur and fewer breaks. And yes, sometimes you missed. Sometimes you hit your own horse's tail. Sometimes your arrow went rogue and took out a tent pole. But that's why you practiced, over and over, until your arms ached, your fingers blistered, and your horse started giving you side eye every time you reached for your bow. Because in the Mongol Empire, archery wasn't a hobby. It was your resume, your insurance policy, and your main form of communication with enemies. Hunting wolves and deer for practice. Because paper targets don't run, bite, or try to gore you. And where's the fun in that? In the Mongol Empire, target practice wasn't about standing still and aiming at a polite circle on a hay bale. It was about chasing down something that very much did not want to be caught, and might try to eat you in the process. Wolves were a favorite, not because they were easy, but because they were fast, clever, and had a tendency to turn around and say, "You know what? Let's fight." If you could hit a wolf at full sprint from horseback, congratulations, you were now qualified to terrify Europe. Deer were also on the menu, both literally and figuratively. They were fast, agile, and excellent for training your aim and your patience. You had to track them across open plains, through forests, and over terrain that made your horse question your judgment. Miss your shot. Too bad. The deer vanished, your dinner ran off, and your uncle laughed at you for a week. These hunts weren't just about food. They were fire drills. You practiced stealth, coordination, and the fine art of not falling off your horse while drawing a bow with frozen fingers. You learned to read the land, anticipate movement, and shoot without hesitation, because in battle, hesitation got you trampled, or worse, demoted to goat, herding duty. And let's not forget the group hunts. Entire units would ride out together, surrounding prey in coordinated formations. It was like a deadly ballet, except everyone smelled like leather and mutton. You had to communicate silently, move in sync, and not accidentally shoot your cousin in the leg. Again, these hunts forged warriors. They sharpened reflexes, built endurance, and taught you that nature was not your friend. It was your sparring partner. And if you could outwit a wolf, you could probably outwit a knight in shiny armor who thought yelling loudly was a strategy. Mock battles and harsh discipline under the eyes of elders, because nothing says bonding experience like getting tackled by your best friend while your grandfather critiques your footwork. Training in the Mongol Empire wasn't a casual after-school activity. It was a full contact, dust, choked, bruise, generating rite of passage. From a young age, boys were thrown into mock battles that were only mock, in the sense that no one intended to die. Everything else, pain, sweat, the occasional chipped tooth, was very real. These weren't friendly sparring matches. They were chaotic, dusty brawls with sticks, shields, and the unspoken goal of impressing the grumpiest elder watching from a hide stool. The elders didn't just observe, they judged. Harshly, Mr. Swing. Your aim is as crooked as your uncle's back. Got knocked down. The goat fights harder when I try to milk it. Land a good hit. Finally. Maybe you're not completely useless. Praise was rare, but when it came, it felt like being knighted by a thunder god. These mock battles taught more than combat. They taught resilience, teamwork, and how to take a hit without crying in front of your crush. You learn to read your opponent's movements, anticipate attacks, and never, ever turn your back on your cousin Baitar, who had a suspiciously good aim and a grudge from last week's stew incident. And the discipline. Oh, it was relentless. If you slacked off, you ran laps. If you disrespected an elder, you scrubbed saddles until your fingers went numb. If you lost your temper, you were benched, and not gently. The elders believed in tough love, minus the love. They'd seen war. They'd seen famine. They'd seen what happened when a warrior hesitated, so they made sure you didn't. But despite the bruises, the yelling, and the occasional accidental spear to the shin, these mock battles forged bonds stronger than steel. You fought beside your friends, bled beside your brothers, and earned the right to be called a warrior. Not by winning, but by getting up every time you were knocked down. Riding for days without stopping, sleeping in the saddle. Because once training was over, the real test began, and naps were a luxury you took at a trot. In the Mongol Empire, rest was a concept reserved for the dead and the very sneaky. Once you were part of a campaign, the pace was relentless. You didn't ride from point A to point B. You blurred between them. The Mongol army could cover 100 miles in a day, and if you thought that meant a scenic gallop with snack breaks, think again. You rode until your legs forgot they were attached to a body. You rode until your horse started giving you side eye. You rode until the saddle became your bed, your chair, your dining table, and your therapist. Sleeping in the saddle wasn't a trick. It was a necessity. You learned to doze while swaying with the rhythm of your horse, head bobbing like a broken marionette. If you were lucky, your horse didn't veer off course or decide to stop abruptly, launching you into a bush. If you were unlucky, you woke up, mid-charge, with arrows flying and your commander yelling something about flanks and honor. Meals, eaten on horseback. Bathroom breaks, creative, hygiene. Let's just say the wind did its best. You didn't stop unless your horse collapsed, and even then, you just switched to another one. The Mongol army moved like a storm, fast, unpredictable, and deeply inconvenient for anyone in its path. Scouts rode ahead, messengers darted between units, and the main force thundered forward like a mobile apocalypse. And the worst part, you never knew when it would end. You might ride for days with no sign of the enemy, only to be ordered into formation at dawn, bleary-eyed and saddle, sore to launch a surprise attack, or worse, defend against one. There were no weekends, no holidays. Just the endless horizon and the knowledge that if you slowed down, you'd be left behind. Or trampled. Or both. Because in the Mongol Empire, exhaustion wasn't an excuse. It was a rite of passage. You didn't complain. You didn't whine. You just adjusted your saddle sores, tightened your grip, and kept riding. Attacking walled cities, using fear and brutality as tactics. Because when you've ridden halfway across the continent, you don't knock politely. You kick the gates down and make an entrance. The Mongols didn't just attack cities. They unmade them. Walled fortresses that had stood for centuries, smug behind their stone defenses, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that didn't care about tradition, architecture, or your fancy moat. The Mongols saw walls not as obstacles, but as invitations. Oh, you built a wall. Cute. Let's see how it burns. They were masters of siege warfare, and not in the wait them out and hope they run out of snacks kind of way. No, the Mongols brought engineers. Lots of them. Chinese engineers, Persian engineers, anyone who knew how to build a catapult or dig a tunnel. They'd construct siege towers, trebuchets, battering rams, and even mobile shields to protect their troops as they advanced. If you had a gate, they'd smash it. If you had a wall, they'd scale it. If you had a secret escape tunnel, congrats, they probably found it first. But their most powerful weapon wasn't wood or stone. It was fear. The Mongols understood psychological warfare better than most modern armies. They'd send messengers ahead, offering surrender terms. Submit now, pay tribute, and we'll let you live. Probably. Refuse. Well, then they'd make an example out of you. So horrifying that your neighboring cities would surrender before the Mongols even arrived. They'd catapult severed heads over the walls. They'd parade prisoners in front of the gates, sometimes mutilated, sometimes just very loudly regretting their life choices. They'd use captured enemies as human shields, forcing defenders to shoot at their own people. And if the city still resisted, oh boy. Once the walls fell, the gloves came off. The Mongols would pour in like a tidal wave of hooves and steel. They didn't loot first, they cleansed. Soldiers, civilians, monks, merchants. It didn't matter. The city was purged, often down to the last terrified soul. Survivors were rare, and those who lived did so to tell the tale. And that tale spread faster than wildfire in a felt tent. Because that was the point. The Mongols didn't want to fight every city. They wanted cities to surrender themselves. And nothing greased the wheels of submission like the memory of a neighbor's smoldering ruins, and the sound of hooves in the distance. Burning towns, taking slaves, spreading terror to weaken resistance. Because when your reputation precedes you, sometimes the gates open themselves, just to avoid what comes next. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they auditioned for nightmares. Their strategy was simple: be so terrifying that your enemies surrender out of sheer existential dread. And it worked. Word of their approach traveled faster than their horses, which is saying something, because their horses were basically furry missiles with hooves. When the Mongols approached a city, they didn't need to shout threats. Their reputation did the talking. Oh, you're the guys who turned that other city into a smoking crater and used the mayor's skull as a soup bowl. Right this way. The gates are open. Please don't hurt the goats. Entire towns would surrender without a fight, just to avoid becoming a cautionary tale told in screams and smoke. But if a city did resist, oh buddy, that's when the Mongols got creative. They'd burn everything. Homes, temples, bathhouses, which, to be fair, they weren't using anyway. They'd take slaves, artisans, scribes, bakers, anyone who could be useful or mildly entertaining on a long campaign. If you had a skill, congratulations, you were now part of the Mongol Empire. If you didn't, well, you were part of the rubble. And they didn't just burn towns, they broadcasted it. Survivors were left alive on purpose, sent hobbling to the next city with tales of horror and a strong recommendation to surrender immediately. It was like Yelp reviews, but with more fire and fewer stars. Would not recommend resisting. 0 out of 10. Still finding ashes in my shoes. Terror was a tool, and the Mongols wielded it like a master chef wields a cleaver. They didn't want to fight every battle. They wanted you to imagine the battle and decide it wasn't worth it. And honestly, most people agreed. When your options are pay tribute or become a historical footnote with extra crispy edges, tribute starts to sound pretty reasonable. So yes, they burned towns. They took slaves. They spread fear like it was on sale. But it wasn't mindless cruelty. It was strategic, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. The Mongols didn't just win wars. They won them with reputation alone, facing the smell of blood, smoke, and screams daily. Because when your empire is built on conquest, the air freshener is always set to apocalypse. Welcome to the Mongol front lines, where every sunrise smells like barbecue and bad decisions. The aftermath of a siege wasn't just a mess. It was a symphony of sensory trauma. You didn't need a calendar to know what day it was. You just sniffed the air. If it smelled like scorched wood, singed hair, and existential dread, congratulations. It was Tuesday. The battlefield was a buffet of chaos. Blood soaked the ground so thoroughly that even the horses started walking funny. Smoke curled from the ruins of temples, homes, and that one guy's yurt, who definitely shouldn't have mouthed off to the tax collector. Screams echoed across the plains, some from the wounded, some from the looters, and some from people realizing they'd just stepped in something that used to be a person. And you couldn't escape it. The smell clung to your clothes, your hair, your soul. You could bathe in a river, roll in sagebrush, or douse yourself in fermented mare's milk. Not recommended. But the stench of conquest was stubborn. It followed you like a judgmental ghost with a keen nose. Even the victors weren't spared. After the adrenaline wore off, you were left with the scent of victory, which, it turns out, smells a lot like burnt leather and regret. You'd sit around the fire, gnawing on questionable meat, trying not to think about the fact that your boots were still sticky. Someone would crack a joke. Someone else would laugh too hard. And then everyone would go quiet, staring into the flames, pretending not to hear the distant wails of what was left of the city. But this was the cost of empire. The Mongols didn't build the largest contiguous land empire in history by handing out hugs and inspirational quotes. They built it with steel, fire, and the kind of psychological warfare that made even the bravest generals consider early retirement. And when the fires died down, when the screams faded into memory, when the blood dried and the smoke cleared, what came next? Winters were bitterly cold, with freezing winds cutting through layers of felt. Because after the storm of conquest came the silence of survival, and the kind of cold that made you miss the warmth of battle. The Mongol winter wasn't just a season. It was a test of character, clothing, and how many layers of goat hair you could wear before becoming a walking carpet. The steppe transformed into a vast, white wasteland where the wind didn't blow. It attacked. It howled across the plains like a banshee with a personal vendetta, slicing through yurts, cloaks, and your will to live. You could wrap yourself in felt, fur, and the hide of 3 different animals. But the cold still found you. It crept into your boots, your bones, and your soul. Your breath froze midair. Your eyelashes turned into icicles. Your horse exhaled steam like a dragon with seasonal depression. And yet, you still had to ride. Still had to hunt. Still had to pretend that your nose wasn't about to fall off and file for independence. Fires were precious. You didn't waste fuel on comfort. You used it to keep your stew from turning into meat. Popsicles. The hearth in the yurt was the heart of survival, and everyone huddled around it like moths with frostbite. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder with your family, your neighbors, and probably a goat or 2, all trying to absorb enough heat to make it through the night. And the nights, oh, they were long. The sun dipped below the horizon like it owed someone money, and didn't come back for hours. You'd lie awake, listening to the wind rattle the yurt, wondering if your toes were still attached. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by shivering, snoring, and the occasional existential crisis about whether your ancestors really needed to settle in such a frozen wasteland. Even the horses suffered. Their manes froze, their hooves cracked, but they endured, because Mongol horses were built for this. You, on the other hand, were not. You were built for complaining and dreaming of soup. And yet, life went on. You still trained, still patrolled, still prepared for the next campaign. Because the Empire didn't pause for weather. It just added more layers and kept moving. Summers brought dry heat and sandstorms on the steppe. Because if the cold didn't break you, the The sun was waiting with a frying pan and a bad attitude. The Mongol summer was less seasonal warmth and more than set to broil. The sun didn't rise. It attacked. It climbed into the sky like it had something to prove, and spent the rest of the day trying to roast everything below it. The grass turned brittle, the air shimmered with heat, and your deal, once a cozy winter cocoon, became a personal sauna with sleeves. Shade. What shade trees were a rumor? Clouds were on vacation. The only thing casting a shadow was your horse, and even it looked like it was considering early retirement. You'd squint into the distance, hoping for a breeze, only to be greeted by a sandstorm galloping toward you like it owed you money. The wind didn't cool you down. It exfoliated you with sand. At high velocity, sandstorms on the steppe weren't gentle affairs. They were full-blown, face-peeling, visibility, stealing tempests that turned the world into a giant, angry salt shaker. 1 minute you were riding along, minding your business. The next, you were eating sand, blinking sand, and discovering new places sand could hide. Your horse would lower its head. You'd wrap your face in whatever cloth you had left, and together you'd ride blind, hoping not to fall into a marmot hole or off a cliff. Water was a luxury. Streams dried up. Wells became wishful thinking. You rationed every drop like it was liquid gold, sipping slowly while your lips cracked and your tongue turned into jerky. Sweat didn't help. It just evaporated instantly, leaving you salty, sticky, and slightly delirious. You'd hallucinate mirages, argue with mirages, and then apologize to your horse for yelling at a bush. And yet, life didn't stop. You still had to ride, hunt, patrol, and occasionally conquer a city or two. You did it with sunburned cheeks, sand in your teeth, and the kind of determination that only comes from knowing that if you stopped moving, you'd melt into the landscape like a forgotten dumpling. Little shelter outside your yurt. Survival depended on your horse and your skills. Because when the land offers no mercy, you bring your own, and hope your horse doesn't have better plans. The Mongol steppe wasn't exactly known for its hospitality. There were no inns, no roadside diners, and certainly no glamping options. Once you stepped outside your yurt, you were on your own. Just you, your horse, and the vague hope that the weather wouldn't try to murder you today. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, open expanse of good luck with that. A shelter. Huh? Unless you were dragging your yurt behind you like a very determined snail, you had two options. Crouch behind your horse or become one with the nearest shrubs, which, spoiler alert, was probably just a tumbleweed with commitment issues. Your horse, meanwhile, was less faithful companion, and more grumpy coworker who didn't sign up for overtime. It would tolerate your nonsense up to a point, but if you tried to use it as a windbreak one too many times, it might just wander off and leave you to negotiate with the elements. Survival meant knowing how to read the land, find water where there shouldn't be any, and start a fire with 3 twigs and a prayer. You had to know which direction the wind was coming from, which clouds meant rain, and which ones meant run now. You learned to spot danger from miles away, whether it was a rival warband, a pack of wolves, or your cousin returning from a failed hunting trip with a suspiciously empty quiver and a very defensive story. And food. If you didn't pack it, catch it, or milk it, you didn't eat. You might find a few wild onions, or some edible roots if you were lucky, but mostly it was dried meat, fermented dairy, and the occasional beetle that wandered into your stew uninvited. You didn't complain. You just chewed and hoped it wasn't crunchy for the wrong reasons. But the real MVP was your horse. It carried you, fed you via milk, warmed you via body heat, and occasionally judged you via side eye. If it liked you, it might nuzzle your shoulder. If it didn't, it might step on your foot. Either way, you depended on it more than you'd ever admit out loud. Because on the steppe, your horse wasn't just transportation. It was your tent, your heater, your fridge, and your therapist. Wounds easily became infected. Medicine was herbal brews, cauterization, and prayers. Because when you live in a world of sharp arrows, angry wolves, and questionable hygiene, your first aid kit better include fire, herbs, and a strong stomach. In the Mongol Empire, getting injured wasn't just painful. It was a gamble with the Grim Reaper. A scratch could turn into a saga. A gash. That was a group project between bacteria, bad luck, and medieval medicine. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics, and definitely no, take 2 of these and call me in the morning. You got hurt, you got herbs, or heat. Herbal remedies were the first line of defense. Mongol healers brewed concoctions from roots, bark, and whatever plants hadn't been trampled by horses. Some were soothing, some were spicy. Some made you see your ancestors and ask them for advice. You'd drink a bitter tea, smear a pungent paste on the wound, and hope the spirits were in a good mood. If it worked, great. If not, well, time for Plan B. Plan B was cauterization, which is a fancy word for setting your flesh on fire on purpose. A red, hot iron, a flaming stick, or a knife heated until it glowed like an angry comet. These were your tools of healing. The idea was simple. Burn the wound shut before the infection could throw a party. The execution. Less simple. You'd be held down, bite a stick, and scream into the void while someone branded your injury like it owed them money. It was brutal, but sometimes effective. And if it didn't work, at least the infection had less territory to conquer. And then there were the prayers. Because when herbs failed and fire just made things worse, you turned to the divine. Shamans would chant, wave smoke, and possibly slap you with a sacred feather. They'd try to drive out the evil spirits, causing your fever, your swelling, or your sudden tendency to speak in riddles. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But at least you got a cool story out of it. Infections were everywhere. Dirty blades, filthy hands, and battlefield mud made sure of that. You could survive the arrow, survive the fall, survive the angry goat. But if your wound festered, you were in trouble. Pus was a bad sign. Fever was worse. And if you started smelling like spoiled yak milk, people started making funeral arrangements. Still, the Mongols endured. They patched each other up with grit, fire, and whatever plants hadn't been eaten by the horses. Because in a world where everything wanted to kill you, survival was the ultimate flex. Epidemics followed the army plague, typhus, and dysentery. Because if the arrows didn't get you, the germs were waiting with a clipboard and a very enthusiastic handshake. Marching with the Mongol horde wasn't just a military endeavor. It was a traveling petri dish with hooves. Wherever the army went, disease followed like an overly affectionate groupie. You could survive a siege, dodge a volley of arrows, and even outwit a particularly aggressive goat, only to be taken down by a microscopic menace, with no sense of timing. Plague was the headliner. The Black Death didn't just hitch a ride with the Mongols, it practically booked a tour. Fleas on rats, rats on carts, carts in caravans, and suddenly half of Eurasia was coughing ominously. The Mongols may not have invented biological warfare, but they certainly gave it a dramatic flair. There are accounts of them catapulting plague, infected corpses over city walls, like the world's worst gift baskets. Surprise! It's contagious. Typhus and dysentery were the backup dancers, less flashy, but just as deadly. Typhus thrived in the cramped, lice-infested conditions of military camps, where personal hygiene was more of a suggestion than a practice. Dysentery, meanwhile, was the result of drinking water that had more bacteria than actual water. One sip and your insides turned into a slip-en slide of regret. And the symptoms? Oh, delightful. Fever, vomiting, delirium. And the kind of diarrhea that made you question your life choices. You'd be hallucinating about your childhood, goat, while your comrades argued over whether to burn your boots or just bury them with you. Medical care was limited to herbal brews, heated knives, and the occasional shaman waving a feather and muttering something about bad wind. The worst part, you couldn't see it coming. An enemy with a sword you could fight. An enemy with a sneeze, not so much. One day you were fine, the next you were a cautionary tale. And because the army moved fast, diseases spread even faster. Leaping from camp to camp like gossip at a yurt, warming party. Death was a constant companion, and funerals were quick. Because when the next battle, or outbreak, was always around the corner, mourning had to fit between saddle adjustments and soup. In the Mongol Empire, grief didn't get a sabbatical. You didn't get to pause the conquest, light 100 candles, and compose a heartfelt eulogy. You got a nod, a grunt, and maybe, a moment of silence before someone yelled, "Mount up," and the caravan rolled on. Death was so common it practically had its own yurt. Funerals were brief, practical, and deeply unceremonious. If someone died in battle, they were buried where they fell, sometimes with their weapons, sometimes with their boots still smoking. If they died in camp, the body was wrapped, buried quickly, and the yurt was either purified or burned, depending on how contagious the cause of death seemed. There were no marble tombs, no elaborate rites, just earth, sky, and the quiet understanding that you might be next. There was no time for mourning clothes or dramatic wailing. You might whisper a prayer, pour out a sip of air-rag, or mutter something like, "He owed me a goat," before moving on. The dead were honored by surviving, by continuing the mission, by not letting their sacrifice go to waste. And if you cried, you did it into your saddle blanket, preferably when no one was looking, especially not your grandmother, who once stitched a wound shut with horsehair and a glare. Even the great Khans weren't immune to the speed-run funeral. Genghis Khan's own burial was shrouded in secrecy, carried out by a small group, who were then allegedly executed to keep the location hidden. That's right. His funeral came with a body count, because in the Mongol worldview, death wasn't the end. It was just another logistical challenge. And so, the army marched on. The fires of grief were banked, the tears swallowed, the memories tucked away like spare arrows. Because the next battle was already on the horizon, and the empire didn't wait for anyone, not even the dead. Women managed yurts, livestock, and children while men raided and fought. Because while the warriors conquered the world, someone had to make sure the goats didn't eat the laundry. In the Mongol Empire, women weren't just background characters. They were the logistical masterminds behind the curtain of conquest. While the men galloped off to rewrite the borders of Eurasia, the women stayed behind to make sure the entire civilization didn't collapse into a pile of unwashed tunics and confused livestock. Running a yurt wasn't a cozy domestic affair. It was a full-time job with no weekends, and a very demanding clientele. Read everyone. Women built the yurts, packed them up, unpacked them, and then rebuilt them again every time the camp moved, which was often. They were like nomadic interior designers with a flair for structural engineering and a deep distrust of wind. Livestock, also their domain. Women milked the animals, churned the milk into butter, cheese, and arag, fermented mare's milk, aka Mongol Gatorated, and kept the herds alive through droughts, snowstorms, and the occasional wolf with poor decision-making skills. They knew every goat by name, every sheep by attitude, and could spot a sick cow from a mile away, while squinting into the sun and stirring a pot of stew. Childcare? Naturally. But Mongol parenting wasn't about lullabies and bedtime stories. It was more like, Here's a pony. Try not to fall off. Women raised the next generation of warriors, herders, and yurt wranglers with a mix of tough love, practical skills, and the occasional lovingly thrown boot. They taught their children how to ride, how to milk, how to cook, and how to survive a sandstorm with nothing but a scarf and a strong opinion. And let's not forget the social side. Women hosted guests, managed alliances, and occasionally negotiated marriages like seasoned diplomats with a side hustle in matchmaking. They brewed the drinks, served the meals, and made sure no one accidentally sat in the sacred part of the yurt of Fox Pass, roughly equivalent to insulting someone's horse. So while the men were out conquering kingdoms, the women were conquering chaos. They kept the home fires burning, literally, and ensured that when the warriors returned, they had warm food, healthy animals, and children who could already ride better than half the army. They also rode, hunted, and defended camps if needed. Because when the empire called, Mongol women didn't just answer. They saddled up. These weren't your average medieval housewives baking bread and waiting for a knight in shining armor. Mongol women were more like, hold my arag, I've got this, types. They could ride a horse better than most European nobles could walk. And they didn't just know how to use a bow. They could probably shoot the fleas off a marmot at 50 paces, while braiding their hair. When the men rode off to conquer half the known world, the women didn't just wave goodbye and go back to knitting. They managed the herds, the yurts, the children, the food supply, and the occasional existential crisis. And if trouble came knocking, say, a band of raiders or a particularly bold wolf, they didn't scream. They mounted up. With bows in hand and babies strapped to their backs, they'd ride out like a cavalry of multitasking fury. Training wasn't optional. From a young age, girls learned to ride, shoot, and glare in a way that made grown men reconsider their life choices. They practiced alongside the boys, competed in races, and occasionally won, then reminded everyone about it for the next decade. If a boy got beat by a girl in archery, he didn't just lose the match. He lost his bragging rights until his beard came in. And defending the camp, that was serious business. If enemies approached while the men were away, the women didn't hide. They organized. They formed defensive lines, set traps, and probably gave motivational speeches that made the goats stand at attention. There are stories of Mongol women holding off attackers with nothing but grit, arrows, and the kind of maternal rage usually reserved for toddlers who draw on yurts with charcoal. They were warriors, leaders, and logistical geniuses. They didn't just keep the empire running, they kept it galloping. And if you ever underestimated them, you'd find yourself hogtied with your own reins, wondering how you got outsmarted by someone who just finished milking a yak. Marriage was arranged, and women worked long days in harsh conditions. Because after you've defended the camp from wolves and raiders, nothing says romance like being traded for a herd of sheep and a particularly nice saddle. In the Mongol Empire, love wasn't so much a whirlwind of passion as it was a well-negotiated livestock exchange. Courtship involved fewer poems and more bartering. Fathers sized up potential sons, in law like they were evaluating a new ox. Strong legs, decent teeth, knows how to pitch a yurt, he'll do. Dowries weren't optional. They were the glue that held alliances together. A good match could mean more horses, more grazing land, or at the very least, someone who wouldn't burn the stew. And once you were married, congratulations! You just won a lifetime subscription to hard labor. Mongol women didn't get to lounge around sipping fermented mare's milk and gossiping about yurt decor. They were up before dawn, milking animals, tending fires, wrangling children, and occasionally chasing off wolves with a ladle. Their daily to-do list read like a survival manual or one feed family. 2. Repair saddle. 3. Shear sheep. 4. Don't die. There was no such thing as a day off. Rain, snow, sandstorm. Didn't matter. The livestock needed care. The children needed wrangling. And the yurt wasn't going to sweep itself. And if your husband was off conquering a continent, even better. Now you got to do his chores too. Romantic, right? But despite the arranged nature of marriage, many couples develop deep bonds. Shared hardship has a way of forging strong partnerships, especially when you've both been elbow deep in yak butter and your tent just blew away. Love might not have started the marriage, but it often showed up eventually, usually somewhere between pass the dried meat and help me catch that goat. Tengrism, worship of the eternal blue sky and spirits of nature. Because when your life is ruled by wind, fire, and livestock with attitudes, it helps to have the sky on your side. Tengrism wasn't just a religion. It was a lifestyle, a worldview, and a cosmic customer service plan with no hold music. At its heart was Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a divine force that watched over everything from the highest mountain to the crankiest goat. The Mongols didn't build temples or carve idols. Their cathedral was the open steppe, their altar the wind, and their hymns the sound of hooves thundering across the plains. Nature wasn't just scenery, it was sacred. Mountains had spirits, rivers had moods, trees had opinions. You didn't just walk into a forest. You introduced yourself and hoped the local spirits weren't in a bad mood. Tengrism was deeply animistic. Everything had a soul: rocks, animals, weather patterns, that one particularly aggressive chicken. You respected the land because it noticed. You didn't litter, not because it was rude, but because the earth spirit might retaliate by sending a sandstorm or making your horse mysteriously flatulent for a week. And then there were the ancestors. Oh, the ancestors. They weren't just fond memories. They were active participants in your daily life. You honored them with offerings, prayers, and the occasional awkward family reunion via dream visitation. Forgetting to honor your ancestors was like ghosting your grandma, except she might actually haunt you. Tengrism wasn't about rigid dogma or weekly sermons. It was about balance, harmony, living in sync with the world around you. You didn't conquer nature. You negotiated with it. And if you broke the rules, well, the spirits would let you know. Usually through a suspiciously timed lightning strike or a mysteriously missing horse. Shamans performed rituals to heal the sick and guide spirits. Because when your worldview includes chatty rivers and judgmental clouds, you need someone who speaks fluent spirit. In the Mongol Empire, the shaman wasn't just the village weirdo with a feather hat and a mysterious cough. He, or she, was the spiritual Swiss army knife of the steppe. Need a diagnosis? The shaman would squint at your aura, sniff the wind, and declare that your spleen was haunted. Feeling cursed, they'd break out the drums, the smoke, and a chant that sounded like a remix of thunder and throat singing. You didn't question it. You just hoped the spirits accepted your apology and didn't turn your goat inside out. Shamans were the bridge between the physical and the spiritual, the living and the dead, the "I stubbed my toe" and the "I think a ghost is chewing on my liver." They performed healing rituals using herbs, chants, and the occasional dramatic trance. Picture someone dancing wildly around a fire, waving burning sage, and yelling at invisible entities, while everyone else nodded like, "Yep, classic Tuesday." They didn't just treat illness, they interpreted it. A fever wasn't just a fever. It was a sign that you'd offended a river spirit or forgotten to thank your ancestors for last week's lucky hunt. A headache, probably a mischievous wind demon. A rash, definitely the result of stepping on sacred moss. The cure? A mix of herbal brews, ritual smoke baths, and a stern talking to direct it at the offending spirit. And when someone died, the shaman didn't just mourn. They escorted. They guided the soul to the afterlife, making sure it didn't get lost, take a wrong turn, or decide to stick around and haunt the pantry. They'd chant, drum, and sometimes wear masks to confuse evil spirits, because nothing says, "Back off," like a grown adult in a bird costume yelling at the sky. Shamans were respected, feared, and occasionally avoided at parties. But when things went wrong, when crops failed, when sickness spread, when someone started speaking in riddles and floating slightly off the ground, it was the shaman who stepped in, feathers flying and incense blazing. Fear of angering ancestors or spirits was constant, because when your grandma's ghost might be watching, you think twice before skipping the offering or insulting the weather. In the Mongol worldview, the spirit realm wasn't some distant, abstract concept. It was your nosy neighbor, your cosmic supervisor, and your passive-aggressive great aunt all rolled into one. The ancestors weren't just remembered, they were present, watching, judging, occasionally rearranging your luck like a bored poltergeist with a to-do list. You didn't just forget to leave an offering and move on. You felt it. Your horse tripped. Your stew curdled. Your left eye twitched for 3 days. Clearly, someone in the afterlife was unimpressed. Maybe you forgot to burn incense. Maybe you insulted a sacred rock. Maybe you sneezed during a ritual and didn't say, "Excuse me." Whatever it was, the spirits noticed, and they were not subtle about their disapproval. Offerings were serious business. A bit of food, a splash of arag, a whispered prayer. These weren't just traditions, they were spiritual insurance policies. You didn't want to be the one who skipped Ancestor Day, and then mysteriously lost 3 goats and your favorite pair of boots. Coincidence? The elders didn't think so. And the weather? Oh, the weather had feelings. You didn't complain about the wind, unless you wanted it to double in speed and slap you with your own tent flap. You didn't mock the rain unless you were ready to spend the next week soggy and apologizing. Mongols treated the elements like temperamental relatives, respected, appeased, and never, ever mocked in public. Even dreams weren't safe. If you dreamed of a crow, a snake, or your dead uncle giving you side eye, you immediately consulted a shaman. Was it a warning? A message? A cosmic prank? Better safe than spiritually sorry. And if your livestock started acting weird, like your sheep suddenly refused to face east, you didn't shrug it off. You lit some incense, muttered a prayer, and maybe sacrificed a dumpling just to be sure. Because in a world where the line between the living and the dead was thinner than your winter socks, you didn't take chances. You respected the spirits, honored the ancestors, and never assumed that weird noise in the yurt was just the wind. Omens from birds, dreams, and weather-guided decisions. Because when the sky, the animals, and your subconscious all start whispering the same thing, you saddle up or stay home. In the Mongol Empire, strategic planning wasn't just about maps and manpower. It was about vibes. If the wind howled weirdly, if a crow landed facing west, or if you had a dream where your horse turned into your uncle and told you not to invade Persia, you listened. Because ignoring omens was like ignoring your GPS when it says, "Turn left." Except instead of getting lost, you might get ambushed and immortalized as that guy who didn't listen to the owl. The birds were the original intelligence officers. A hawk circling high. Good sign. A raven cawing 3 times before breakfast. Cancel your plans. A pigeon pooping on your helmet. Mixed signals. Mongol commanders would literally delay campaigns because a bird flew the wrong way, and no one argued. Because arguing with omens was like arguing with the weather. Loud, pointless, and likely to end with you wet and embarrassed. Dreams were another hotline to the divine. If you dreamed of fire, it might mean victory. If you dreamed of drowning, it might mean betrayal. If you dreamed of your horse speaking fluent Persian and asking for a raise, well, maybe lay off the fermented mare's milk. Shamans were called in to interpret these dreams, often with the same seriousness modern generals reserve for satellite imagery. The Khan dreamed of a white wolf dancing on a mountain. Excellent. We attack at dawn. And then there was the weather. Mongols didn't just check the forecast, they consulted it. A sudden storm could mean the spirits were angry. A clear sky after a funeral might mean the ancestors approved. A double rainbow. Probably just pretty, but still worth noting. If the wind changed direction mid-ritual, the entire ceremony might be restarted. Because when the sky speaks, you don't interrupt. You take notes. All of this wasn't superstition. It was strategy. The Mongols believed that success came from harmony with the world around them. If the signs said, "Go," they went. If the signs said, "Stay," they stayed. And if the signs said, "Maybe don't invade that heavily fortified city during a solar eclipse," they at least considered it. The Mongol Empire's vastness allowed for trade from China to Europe. Because once you've conquered half the world, you might as well open a few gift shops along the way. And oh, did they? The Mongols didn't just build an empire. They built a superhighway of commerce, diplomacy, and the occasional exotic animal exchange. With their conquest stretching from the Pacific to the Danube, they created the first truly global trade zone. Centuries before anyone thought to invent customs, declarations, or frequent trader miles. This era of connectivity was known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. And while peace might be a generous term for an empire that occasionally catapulted heads over city walls, it did mean that merchants could travel from Sheen to Venice without being robbed, taxed into oblivion, or accidentally conscripted into a local militia. The Mongols protected trade routes like they were sacred arteries of empire, which, to them, they were. They revitalized the Silk Road, turning it from a dusty trail of broken dreams into a bustling artery of commerce. Goods flowed like gossip at a royal banquet: silk, porcelain, jade, paper, gunpowder, and tea from the east, glassware, silver, wool, wine, and occasionally confused missionaries from the west. Ideas traveled too: mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and the occasional spicy philosophical debate. And it wasn't just about stuff. The Mongols issued paisa, metal passports, that granted safe passage and VIP treatment to merchants. Need a place to stay? There were yam stations every 25-30 miles, offering food, fresh horses, and a place to rest your sand-blasted face. It was like a medieval version of Amazon Prime, but with more camels and fewer delivery drones. Even Marco Polo got in on the action, traveling all the way to Kublai Khan's court and returning with tales so wild people thought he'd invented half of them. Spoiler, he probably did. But for all the glittering trade and cultural exchange, the roads weren't entirely safe. Because while the Mongols did their best to keep things orderly, caravans brought silk, spices, and slaves, but bandit attacks were common. Because even in a well-oiled empire, there's always someone lurking in the dunes with a knife and a bad attitude. The Mongol Empire may have been the medieval equivalent of a global shipping company, with express delivery and surprisingly decent customer service. But that didn't mean the roads were safe. Oh no. The Silk Road wasn't paved with gold, it was paved with opportunity. And bandits were the original opportunists. They didn't care if you were carrying priceless silk or just a suspiciously heavy bag of raisins. If it jingled, sparkled, or smelled vaguely expensive, they wanted it. Caravans were like walking treasure chests. Silk from China, spices from India, slaves from Central Asia, and occasionally a confused diplomat who took a wrong turn. These convoys were irresistible to thieves. And not just your run of the mill pickpockets. We're talking full-blown desert pirates with camels, swords, and a business model based entirely on finders keepers. Merchants knew the risks. That's why they traveled in massive groups, sometimes hundreds strong, with armed guards, scouts, and that one guy who insisted on bringing a loot for morale. They formed tight formations, posted night watches, and kept their valuables hidden in places no one wanted to search, like under the camel with digestive issues. But even then, bandits were clever. They knew the terrain, the shortcuts, and the best ambush spots. Usually right after the last oasis, when everyone was tired, thirsty, and slightly sunburned. Some bandits were former soldiers. Others were just really enthusiastic about wealth redistribution. A few were even local warlords moonlighting as tax collectors. They'd swoop in, demand tribute, and vanish into the dunes before you could say, "Wet? Was that my best camel?" And if you thought the Mongol Empire's reputation scared them off, think again. Sure, the Mongols were terrifying, but the empire was huge. You couldn't post a guard every mile. There were gaps, and in those gaps, bandits, with knives and bad attitudes. So merchants got creative. They used decoy wagons, false bottom carts, and sometimes just bribed the bandits ahead of time. Here's a sack of silver. Please rob the next caravan. They've got better snacks. It wasn't ideal, but it beat getting stabbed over a bolt of brocade. Travel was harsh, rough roads, extreme weather, and the constant threat of raids. Because when your journey includes avalanches, sandstorms, and surprise sword fights, you start to miss the comforts of home. Like walls. Imagine setting out on a trade expedition across the Mongol Empire. You've got your caravan, your camels, your wares, and a vague sense of optimism. That optimism lasts about 10 minutes, right up until your cartwheel hits the first pothole the size of a yurt. The roads weren't roads so much as suggested directions, often indistinguishable from goat trails or dried up riverbeds. If you were lucky, you only broke a wheel. If you were unlucky, you broke a wheel, a rib, and your traveling companion's last nerve. Then came the weather. The Mongol Empire spanned everything from frozen tundra to scorching desert, and the climate had the emotional range of a Shakespearean villain. One day you were trudging through snow, so deep your horse looked like a furry periscope. The next, you were peeling your boots off the sand, because they'd fused to the ground. Rainstorms turned paths into mudslides. Windstorms exfoliated your face whether you wanted it or not. And sandstorms, they didn't just blind you, they judged you. And just when you thought, well, at least it can't get worse, raiders. Because nothing spices up a long journey like a surprise ambush from people who think your silk bolts would look better in their tent. Bandits were the unofficial toll collectors of the steppe. They didn't care about your trade permits or your sob story about feeding your family. They cared about loot, horses, and occasionally your boots, if they looked comfy. You could hire guards, of course, but they were expensive, grumpy, and had a tendency to disappear right before the trouble started. Some merchants traveled in massive caravans for safety, which worked great until someone sneezed near a superstitious camel and the whole formation scattered like startled pigeons. And let's not forget the wildlife. Wolves, bears, venomous snakes, and the occasional very territorial yak. You weren't just navigating terrain. You were navigating a buffet line where you were the entree. So yes, travel was brutal. But it was also necessary. Trade was the lifeblood of the empire, and merchants braved it all for the promise of profit, prestige, and maybe a new pair of boots that hadn't been stolen yet. Heavy taxes were collected by force. Because after surviving bandits, blizzards, and blistered feet, nothing says, "Welcome home," like a tax collector with a sword and a suspiciously cheerful grin. In the Mongol Empire, paying taxes wasn't a civic duty, it was a survival tactic. You didn't file your taxes, you surrendered them. And if you thought you could negotiate delay or claim a deduction for emotional trauma caused by sandstorms, think again. The tax collector didn't come with a clipboard and a polite smile. He came with armed escorts, a list of names, and the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for bounty hunters and overly competitive goat wrestlers. The Mongols had a very efficient tax system. You owed, they collected. Simple. Taxes were levied on everything: livestock, grain, trade goods, your neighbor's suspiciously large yurt. If it moved, grew, or sparkled, it was taxable. And if you didn't pay, well, let's just say the collectors didn't leave empty-handed. They'd take your goods, your animals, your furniture, and if they were feeling particularly thorough, your boots. You could always try to hide your wealth, but Mongol tax agents had a sixth sense for buried treasure and a seventh sense for lies. And don't even think about pleading poverty. I have nothing left. You'd cry, clutching your last goat. Then you won't miss it, the collector would reply, already tying it to his saddle. Sympathy was not part of the training manual. Efficiency was. And if you resisted, that's when the force part kicked in. Soldiers would descend like vultures with paperwork, and suddenly your yurt was a tax, deductible pile of ash. Merchants were hit especially hard. After surviving the Silk Road's greatest hits, sandstorms, bandits, dysentery, and that one camel who definitely had a grudge, they'd finally reach a city, only to be greeted by a tax officer with the energy of a caffeinated squirrel and the authority of a minor deity. Welcome. That'll be 30% of your goods, 10% of your profits, and a small you-made-it-alive fee. But here's the kicker. The Mongols didn't just collect taxes. They expected gratitude. After all, they were providing protection, infrastructure, and the privilege of not being impaled. And to be fair, the roads were safest, mostly. Trade was booming when not being looted, and the empire was relatively stable, if you ignored the occasional siege. So yes, you paid. You grumbled. You handed over your coins, your carpets, your cousin's prized sheep. Because the alternative, rebellion, was met with mass executions. Because if you thought unpaid taxes were painful, try being the example in a Mongol lesson on why obedience matters. The Mongols didn't do subtle. If you rebelled, they didn't send a sternly worded letter or a delegation of frowning bureaucrats. They sent an army, and not just any army. A highly mobile, terrifyingly efficient, multilingual death machine with a flair for dramatic punctuation. Rebellion wasn't just discouraged, it was obliterated. Let's say your town decided to get bold. Maybe you thought the tribute was too high. Maybe you didn't like the tone of the tax collector. Maybe someone got a little too inspired by a dream involving a flaming eagle and a talking goat. Whatever the reason, you refused to pay. You resisted. You rebelled. Big mistake. The Mongols would respond with overwhelming force, not just to defeat you, but to make an example of you. They'd surround your city, cut off supplies, and then unleash a siege so brutal it made your ancestors wince retroactively. Once the walls fell, the executions began. Leaders gone. Soldiers gone. Civilians often gone too. The message was clear. This is what happens when you say no. And they didn't stop at swords. They used psychological warfare like it was an art form. Survivors, if any, were left alive on purpose, sent hobbling to the next town with horror stories and a 1,000-yard stare. Don't resist, they'd whisper. We did. Now our mayor's head is a paperweight. The Mongols weren't cruel for cruelty's sake. They were strategic. Every execution, every razed village, every pile of skulls was a warning sign written in blood and fire: obey, or vanish. And it worked. Cities surrendered without a fight. Kingdoms paid tribute without a fuss. Because the alternative wasn't just defeat. It was erasure. Many cities that resisted were destroyed as a warning. Because when your empire runs on fear and efficiency, mercy is just bad for business. The Mongols didn't just conquer. They curated a reputation so terrifying that it practically marched ahead of them, knocking on city gates and whispering, "You might want to rethink your life choices." Resistance wasn't just futile. It was fatal. And not in a "you lose the battle" kind of way. More like, your city becomes a cautionary tale told in hushed tones by traumatized merchants for the next 100 years. When a city dared to defy the Mongol horde, the response was swift, brutal, and theatrical. We're talking full-scale sieges, walls reduced to rubble, and streets that ran redder than a poorly mixed dye vat. The Mongols didn't just defeat you, they erased you. Buildings were leveled, libraries torched, and populations systematically wiped out or enslaved. Survivors were rare, and those who lived often wished they hadn't. Their job: spread the word. Don't resist. Seriously. I still have nightmares about what they did to the mare. And the Mongols didn't stop at destruction. They documented it. They left behind pyramids of skulls, burned out husks of once thriving cities, and the kind of psychological scars that made even the most fortified kingdoms consider surrendering at the first sight of a dust cloud. Cities like Nishapur, Herat, and Merv weren't just defeated, they were unmade. Their names became synonymous with "don't mess with the Mongols." But here's the genius: this wasn't mindless cruelty. It was policy, a strategic, horrifyingly effective policy. By making examples out of a few, they saved themselves the trouble of fighting many. Why waste resources storming every city when you can just point to the smoldering crater that used to be your neighbor and say, "You're next"? And it worked. Cities surrendered without a fight. Rulers sent tribute, hostages, and very flattering letters. The Mongols didn't have to conquer every inch. They just had to make sure everyone believed they could. Fear was their most efficient weapon, and they wielded it with the precision of a surgeon and the flair of a theater troupe. For peasants, survival meant submission. Because when the empire rolls in with arrows, fire, and a reputation for turning cities into ashtrays, you learn real fast that obedience is cheaper than rebuilding. Life under Mongol rule wasn't exactly a utopia of freedom and self-expression. If you were a peasant, your job was simple. Keep your head down, pay your taxes, and try not to look like someone who might start a rebellion. The Mongols didn't care about your poetry, your dreams, or your prize, winning turnips. They cared about order, tribute, and making sure you didn't get any funny ideas about independence. Submission wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. You plowed your fields, handed over your grain, and smiled politely when the tax collector took your last chicken. For the Khan, you didn't argue, you didn't protest. You nodded, bowed, and hoped your yurt didn't end up as kindling in a lesson about loyalty. But here's the twist: if you did submit, life could actually be tolerable. The Mongols were surprisingly pragmatic overlords. They didn't micromanage. They didn't force you to learn Mongolian or wear official empire-approved tunics. As long as you paid up and didn't cause trouble, they mostly left you alone. You could keep your customs, your religion, and your deeply suspicious goat. In fact, some peasants found Mongol rule preferable to their previous overlords. Less feudal drama, more predictable tax schedules. Still, the fear never left. You always knew that one wrong move, one missed payment, one whispered rumor, one cousin who got a little too bold, and the consequences would be swift and spectacular. The Mongols didn't do warnings. They did examples, and no one wanted to be the next example. So peasants adapted. They became masters of quiet compliance. They learned to read the mood of the local governor, to hide their best grain under false flaws, and to feign enthusiasm during imperial inspections. They survived not by fighting, but by enduring. Because in a world ruled by horsemen with a flair for dramatic overkill, survival was the ultimate rebellion. Disputes were settled quickly and often violently. Because when your legal system involves swords, grudges, and very few second chances, mediation tends to be loud and final. In the Mongol Empire, justice wasn't blind. It was squinting down the shaft of an arrow. There were no lengthy court proceedings, no powdered wigs, and certainly no objection, Your Honor. If you had a problem with someone, you didn't file a complaint, you sharpened it. Disputes were resolved with a mix of tradition, tribal law, and the occasional well-aimed horse kick. Let's say your neighbor stole your goat. In some societies, this might lead to a stern letter or a small claims court appearance. In Mongol society, it might lead to a duel, a public shaming, or a very tense yurt-side negotiation involving extended family livestock and a lot of yelling. If things escalated, someone might end up with a broken nose or a new scar to explain at dinner. And if the dispute involved land, honor, or horses. Oh, now it was serious. Mongols took their horses and reputations very seriously. Insult someone's riding skills or accuse them of cheating in a race, and you might find yourself in a trial by combat situation before you could say, "Let's talk this out." The idea was simple. If you were right, the spirits would protect you. If you were wrong, well, at least your opponent got to feel vindicated and get a new horse. There were laws, of course. Yasa, the code attributed to Genghis Khan, laid out rules for everything from theft to adultery, to how many times you could bathe without being suspicious. But enforcement was swift and often brutal. There was no appeals process, no jury of your peers, just a local official, a few witnesses, and the looming possibility of a punishment that involved ropes, fire, or a very long walk into exile. And the best part, everyone knew the rules. You didn't need a law degree. You just needed a good memory and a healthy fear of public execution. Disputes were settled not to restore harmony, but to prevent chaos. The goal wasn't fairness, it was order. And if that meant a few broken bones, or a dramatic sword fight in the middle of the camp, so be it. Even a small crime could result in execution or enslavement. Because when your empire is built on discipline and fear, mercy is a luxury, and jaywalking might just cost you your freedom. In the Mongol Empire, the concept of minor offense didn't really exist. There was no such thing as a slap on the wrist, unless that slap was followed by shackles or a sword. You stole a loaf of bread. That could be interpreted as theft, rebellion, or just a very poor life choice. The punishment, possibly death, or enslavement, or both, in that order. The Mongols didn't believe in overcrowded prisons or lengthy appeals. Their justice system was more on and done. If you were caught committing a crime, the response was immediate and memorable. You might be executed on the spot, or handed over to a local official who specialized in creative consequences. And if you were lucky enough to survive, congratulations, you were now property. Someone's property. Possibly the guy whose goat you insulted last week. Enslavement wasn't just a punishment, it was a warning. You'd be paraded through camp, stripped of your freedom, your dignity, and probably your shoes. You'd be assigned to the worst jobs, mucking out stables, hauling supplies, or serving as a very nervous human scarecrow. And everyone who saw you would think, so that's what happens when you try to cheat at dice. The Mongols didn't do nuance. They did order. And order required consequences. Harsh ones. The idea was simple. If people feared the punishment more than they desired the crime, society would stay in line. And for the most part it worked. Crime rates were low, not because people were inherently good, but because they were terrified of what would happen if they weren't. Even petty offenses, lying, cheating, disrespecting authority, could land you in serious trouble. And if you were a repeat offender, let's just say the Mongols didn't believe in 3 strikes. They believed in on strike. And we strike back harder. Justice was swift, and fear maintained order. Because when your empire stretches across continents, you don't have time for second chances. You have time for examples. The Mongol legal system didn't believe in dragging things out. There were no drawn-out trials, no appeals, and certainly no innocent until proven guilty. Banners fluttering in the wind. If you broke the law broke you. Quickly, decisively, and often in front of a very attentive audience. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about performance. A warning, a message, a very loud, very final punctuation mark at the end of a very short sentence. Theft, execution. Lying to an official, execution. Insulting a superior, execution with a side of public humiliation. The Mongols didn't do nuance, they did clarity. And clarity meant that everyone, from the lowliest herder to the highest ranking general, knew exactly what would happen if they stepped out of line. Spoiler, it involved ropes, blades, and a distinct lack of future plans. But here's the twist: this brutal efficiency worked. Crime rates were low, order was high, and the empire functioned like a well-oiled war machine with a clipboard. People behaved not because they were saints, but because they liked their heads attached, and their families unenslaved. The fear of punishment was so deeply ingrained that even thinking about breaking the law probably made your ancestors sweat. And the Mongols didn't discriminate. Whether you were a merchant, a soldier, or a visiting dignitary with a suspiciously large pouch of coins, the rules applied. Harshly. Equally. Publicly. Justice wasn't just a system, it was a spectacle. And everyone had front row seats. Each Mongol owned several horses, rotating them during long rides. Because when your empire spans deserts, mountains, and frozen wastelands, your transportation strategy better involve horsepower, and lots of it. And by several, we don't mean 2 or 3. We mean a personal fleet. Your average Mongol warrior had more horses than most people have socks. 1 for riding, 1 for racing, 1 for hauling gear, 1 for backup, 1 for emotional support, and probably 1 that just hung around looking majestic. It wasn't a cavalry, it was a mobile petting zoo with attitude. Why so many horses? Because Mongol campaigns weren't weekend getaways. These were epic, continent-spanning road trips with no rest stops and a very aggressive itinerary. A single horse couldn't handle that kind of mileage without turning into a very expensive rug, so they rotated mounts like a medieval NASCAR pit crew. Ride one until it's tired, switch to the next, repeat. It kept the horses fresh, the riders fast, and the enemies deeply confused. This system gave the Mongols unmatched mobility. While other armies were still lacing up their boots and arguing about who forgot the siege ladders, the Mongols were already 200 miles away, sipping fermented mare's milk and planning their next ambush. They could cover up to 160 kilometers in a day, on horseback. That's not travel. That's teleportation with hooves. And these weren't pampered show ponies. Mongol horses were short, shaggy, and built like tanks with manes. They could survive on frozen grass, gallop through blizzards, and probably file their own taxes if asked. They didn't need fancy stables or special feed. Just open steppe, a bit of grass, and the occasional motivational speech from their rider. Even communication relied on this equine relay system. The Mongols had a postal network, the Yam, where messengers rode from station to station, swapping horses like caffeinated couriers on a mission from the gods. It was fast, efficient, and only occasionally interrupted by wolves or existential dread. So yes, each Mongol had multiple horses. Not because they were spoiled, but because they were smart. When your empire stretches from Korea to Hungary, you don't walk, you gallop, switch horses mid-sentence, and keep going until the map runs out of ink. Horses provided milk, meat, hides, and transport. Because when your best friend is also your fridge, your heater, your Uber, and your lunch, that's a real ride or die. In the Mongol Empire, horses weren't just animals. They were everything. They were your livelihood, your mobility, your pantry, your wardrobe, and occasionally your dinner. Mongol horses were the Swiss Army knives of the steppe, compact, durable, and capable of doing about 12 jobs before breakfast. Need a ride across 300 miles of frozen wasteland. Saddle up. Need to churn some arag, fermented mare's milk for a family feast. Time to milk the cavalry. Feeling a bit peckish and out of jerky. Well, sorry buttercup, but dinner's served. Mongols didn't waste a single part of the horse. The meat was rich in protein. The milk was a staple, the hides became clothing and tack, and the bones. Excellent for tools, dice, or ominous decorations, and warmth. Oh, yes, in the dead of winter, a horse wasn't just a ride. It was a space heater with hooves. You'd huddle beside it, share body heat, and whisper sweet nothings like, "Please don't roll over in your sleep." Mongol children grew up learning to ride before they could walk, and by the time they were teenagers, they could probably saddle a horse blindfolded while reciting their family lineage backward. Even the dung had a purpose. Dried horse manure made excellent fuel, because nothing says cozy evening like a fire fueled by yesterday's oats. Mongol life was so intertwined with horses that if you took them away, the entire society would collapse faster than a yurt in a windstorm. So yes, horses were sacred, not in a put them on a pedestal way, but in a this creature is literally keeping me alive way. They were companions, tools and symbols of freedom. And if you treated your horse well, it would carry you through blizzards, battles, and bad decisions without complaint, though possibly with a bit of side eye. Losing a horse meant losing status and survival, because when your entire life is built on 4 hooves and a tail, one missing mane can unravel your whole world. In the Mongol Empire, a horse wasn't just a mode of transport. It was your identity, your livelihood, your emergency exit, and your emotional support animal all rolled into one. Losing a horse was like losing your phone, your wallet, your house keys, and your best friend in one galloping disaster. You didn't just misplace a steed. You triggered a full-blown existential crisis. Imagine showing up to a gathering of warriors on foot. On foot. You'd be the medieval equivalent of the guy who shows up to a Formula One race on a tricycle. People would stare. Children would whisper. Goats would judge. Your social standing would plummet faster than a saddlebag full of bricks. Where's your horse? Someone would ask, and you'd have to mumble something about a tragic marmot incident, while trying not to cry into your fur-lined collar. And it wasn't just about pride without a horse. You couldn't travel, couldn't hunt, couldn't fight, and couldn't flee when your neighbor's yurt party got out of hand. You were stuck, literally and metaphorically. You might as well have tattooed "Easy Target" on your forehead and waited for the next raiding party to come along and turn you into a cautionary tale. Horses were also your bank account. They were wealth on legs. The more horses you had, the richer and more respected you were. Lose one, and suddenly your net worth dropped faster than a merchant's prices during a sandstorm sale. People would start asking awkward questions like, "Did you really tie it up properly?" Or, "Have you considered a career in goat herding?" And don't even get me started on the emotional toll. Mongols bonded with their horses. They named them, sang to them, whispered secrets into their manes. Losing one was like losing a piece of your soul. Except that piece also carried your tent, your weapons, and your fermented milk supply. You'd wander the steppe, muttering your horse's name like a tragic ballad, while your remaining animals sighed. Eyed you like, "We're next, aren't we?" So yes, losing a horse was catastrophic. It meant walking. It meant shame. It meant explaining to your commander why you showed up to battle looking like a lost shepherd with commitment issues. And worst of all, it meant you had to carry your own gear. Your own gear. The horror. Arrows, bows, lances, and curved swords were maintained constantly. Because when your horse is your ride or die, your weapons better be sharp enough to make sure it doesn't become just die. In the Mongol Empire, weapon maintenance wasn't a chore. It was a sacred ritual, a survival strategy, and a competitive sport all rolled into one. Every warrior was a walking armory, and every piece of that armory had to be in pristine, battle-ready condition at all times. You didn't just own weapons, you bonded with them. You sharpened your sword like it was a beloved pet. You polished your bow like it was your reflection. And your arrows, you counted them more often than your children. Let's start with the bow, the Mongol composite bow, a masterpiece of engineering and menace. Made from wood, horn, sinew, and sheer spite, it was compact, powerful, and capable of launching an arrow with enough force to ruin someone's day from 300 yards away. These bows were so strong they had to be strung against their natural curve, which meant unstringing them when not in use to prevent warping. Every warrior carried at least 2, sometimes 3, because you never knew when one might snap, or when you'd want to show off. Arrows were equally important. Mongols didn't just carry a few. They carried dozens, each with a specific purpose. Broadheads for slicing, bodkin points for piercing armor, and whistling arrows for psychological warfare, because nothing says incoming doom like a high-pitched scream from the sky. Arrowheads were hardened in fire and brine, fletched with eagle feathers, and sometimes dipped in poison for that extra surprise factor. Losing an arrow was like losing a coin, a tool, and a tiny, deadly friend all at once. Then there were the lancers, long, sturdy, and often tipped with hooks for yanking enemies off horses like medieval rodeo clowns. These weren't just for charging. They were for dragging, poking, and occasionally vaulting over confused foot soldiers. A well-maintained lance could mean the difference between glorious victory and awkwardly apologizing to your horse for falling off again. And of course, the curved sword, the scimitar, the saber, the blade that said, "I'm fast, I'm flashy, and I'm not here to negotiate." These swords were honed to a terrifying edge, curved for maximum slicing efficiency, and often decorated with just enough flair to say, "Yes, I am that dangerous." Warriors sharpened them daily, tested them on straw dummies or unlucky shrubs, and kept them close enough to grab in their sleep. Weapon upkeep wasn't optional. It was a lifestyle. You cleaned your gear like your life depended on it, because it did. A dull blade or a warped bowstring could mean disaster. So Mongols carried files, whetstones, spare strings, and enough backup gear to outfit a small militia. They were mobile, lethal, and always prepared, like a traveling weapons expo with attitude. Armor was made of leather and iron scales, heavy in heat, because when you're galloping into battle, under the blazing sun, nothing says commitment like sweating through 3 layers of handcrafted doom. Mongol armor wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for survival, intimidation, and the occasional dramatic entrance. Picture this. You're riding across the steppe. The sun is baking the earth into a giant griddle, and you're wrapped in a suit made of boiled leather and overlapping iron scales. You're basically a walking kettle. But hey, you look fabulous, and you're significantly harder to stab. The armor itself was a marvel of practicality and pain tolerance. The base layer was often hardened leather, boiled, beaten, and shaped into a flexible shell that could absorb blows and deflect arrows. Over that came the iron scales, sewn or riveted onto the leather like medieval sequins of doom. These scales overlapped like fish skin, offering protection without turning the wearer into a rigid tin can. It was the perfect balance of mobility and menace. But let's talk about the heat. Wearing this armor in summer was like wrapping yourself in a portable forge. You'd sweat in places you didn't know could sweat. Your underlayers would cling to you like a desperate ex. And the smell, a pungent blend of horse leather, iron, and regret. Mongol warriors didn't just fight the enemy. They fought dehydration, heat stroke, and the constant temptation to strip down and sprint into the nearest river. Still, the armor worked. It protected against arrows, blades, and the occasional angry goat. It was light enough to ride in, strong enough to survive a skirmish, and intimidating enough to make your enemies reconsider their life choices. And if it got damaged, no problem. Mongols were masters of field repair. A broken scale could be replaced with a spare, a torn strap could be re-tied. And if all else failed, you just borrowed your cousin's set and hoped he didn't notice. Some warriors even personalized their armor, adding decorations, etchings or trophies from past battles. Nothing said, "Don't mess with me." Like a chest plate adorned with the teeth of your enemies, and a suspiciously cheerful smile. But armor alone didn't win battles. It was just one part of the Mongol war machine. A machine that ran on precision, planning, and the kind of intelligence that came from watching your enemies very closely. Raids were planned meticulously, using scouts and spies. Because when your battle strategy starts with, "Let's know everything about them before they know we exist," you're not just fighting smart, you're fighting like a Mongol. The Mongols didn't just ride into battle yelling, "Surprise!" They engineered surprise. Every raid was a masterclass in reconnaissance, deception, and psychological warfare. Before a single arrow was loosed, the Mongols already knew your troop numbers, your supply routes, your favorite breakfast, and the name of your cousin who owed you money. Why? Because they had scouts, and those scouts had spies, and those spies had spies. Scouts were the eyes of the empire. They rode ahead of the main force, mapping terrain, counting enemy tents, and noting every hill, river, and suspiciously large bush. They moved fast, blended in, and could probably sketch a fortress layout from memory while galloping backwards. If a scout said, "There's a weak point in the wall," you didn't ask how they knew. You just aimed your siege engines accordingly. Spies, on the other hand, were the drama queens of intelligence. They infiltrated enemy cities, disguised as merchants, monks, or that guy who always seems to know a shortcut. They gathered intel, spread rumors, bribed officials, and occasionally convinced entire towns to surrender before the Mongols even showed up. Some spies were locals, some were defectors, and some were just really good at pretending to sell rugs while eavesdropping on military councils. And then came the deception tactics. Fake retreats, phantom armies, and staged arguments designed to lure enemies into traps. The Mongols could make a small force look massive, or a massive force look like it had vanished into thin air. They'd feign panic, scatter like startled pigeons, and then circle back to ambush you while you were still celebrating your victory. It was less like warfare and more like a very aggressive magic trick. All of this planning wasn't just for show. It was deadly effective. Cities fell before they could organize. Armies were crushed before they knew they were being attacked. The Mongols didn't just win battles. They orchestrated them, like conductors of a very loud, very pointy symphony. But such precision required more than just good intel. It demanded a military machine that was always alert, always suspicious, and always ready to ride at a moment's notice. Constant readiness for battle, fear of betrayal, and harsh discipline. Because when your empire is built on speed, loyalty, and the occasional terrifying example, there's no room for nap time or second chances. Being a Mongol warrior wasn't just a job. It was a lifestyle. A very intense, very sweaty, very stabby lifestyle. You didn't get to clock out at 5 p.m. and unwind with a nice cup of yak tea. You were always on alert, always watching, always wondering if that guy sharpening his sword a little too enthusiastically was just really into maintenance, or plotting to turn you into a cautionary tale. The Mongol military code was strict enough to make a drill sergeant cry. You disobeyed orders. That could mean execution. You fell asleep on watch. Execution. You stole from a comrade. Execution with a side of public shaming and possibly a strongly worded yurt side eulogy. The Mongols didn't believe in second chances. They believed in examples. And nothing says, "Don't mess up," like watching your bunkmate get turned into a motivational poster. Loyalty was everything. You were expected to follow your commander's orders without hesitation, even if those orders involved charging into a blizzard, scaling a cliff, or pretending to be a tree for 3 days straight. Betrayal wasn't just frowned upon. It was met with the kind of punishment that made people whisper your name in horror while clutching their horses for comfort. And speaking of horses, you had to be ready to ride at a moment's notice. Mongol camps were like pop-up war zones. 1 minute you're enjoying a bowl of stew. The next you're in full armor, galloping toward an enemy encampment. Because someone saw a suspicious cloud formation. You slept in your boots, kept your weapons within arm's reach, and developed the uncanny ability to wake up swinging if someone sneezed too loudly. Training was constant. Archery drills, formation riding, mock battles, and the occasional "let's see who can wrestle a goat the fastest" contest to keep morale high. You didn't just learn discipline, you lived it. And if you didn't, well, let's just say the Mongols had a very efficient HR department, and it involved fewer memos and more decapitations. But all this intensity came at a cost. When your daily routine includes surprise inspections, loyalty tests, and the looming threat of being turned into a skull pyramid, you start to develop a certain edge, a twitch, a tendency to flinch when someone reaches for their belt pouch too quickly, witnessing brutal violence regularly. Because when your empire runs on conquest and consequences, bloodshed isn't a possibility. It's part of the morning routine. For the average Mongol warrior, violence wasn't shocking. It was scheduled. You didn't flinch at the sight of a beheading. You checked your sundial and thought, right on time. Bloodshed was so common it practically had its own chore wheel. Monday, raid a village. Tuesday, sharpen swords. Wednesday, emotionally process nothing. Thursday, siege warfare. Friday, skull pyramid assembly. Weekend, optional looting and light pillaging, weather permitting. Children grew up playing games like, "Guess what's in the sack?" Spoiler. It was usually something that used to be alive, and pin the arrow on the invader. Coming of age didn't involve a cake and candles. It involved your first successful ambush and a celebratory gulp of fermented mare's milk while someone screamed in the background. And the battlefield. Oh, it was a buffet of brutality. Heads rolled, limbs flew, and arrows rained down like very pointy confetti. If you weren't actively fighting, you were watching someone else do it, and probably rating their form like a blood-soaked Olympic judge. Oh, nice decapitation, but the follow-through lacked finesse. 7.5. Even off the battlefield, violence was never far. Disputes were settled with duels, punishments were public, and executions were a community event. Bring the kids! We'll make a day of it. You bring the yak jerky, I'll bring the existential dread. But here's the thing. It wasn't just normalized. It was ritualized. Violence had rules, rhythms, and a disturbingly well-organized schedule. You didn't just kill someone. You did it with flair, with purpose, and ideally with a dramatic one-liner. Mongol warriors weren't just fighters. They were performers in the grand, gory theater of empire. And after a long day of carnage, you'd sit by the fire, polish your sword, and swap stories like, "Remember that time we stormed that fortress and the gate exploded before we hit it?" Classic. Laughter, blood, and the occasional haunted stare into the middle distance. It was all part of the job. Living with death, harsh survival, and spiritual fear. Because when your daily planner includes battle at dawn and commune with ancestor spirits by dusk, you learn to keep your sword sharp and your soul sharper. In the Mongol Empire, existential dread wasn't a midlife crisis. It was a lifestyle. You didn't need a therapist, you needed a shaman, a sturdy horse, and a really good reason not to cry in public. Death wasn't lurking around the corner. It was galloping toward you on horseback, waving a curved sword and yelling something about honor. Every day was a high, stakes balancing act between staying alive, staying loyal, and staying on the spirit's good side. You could be the fiercest warrior on the steppe, but if you forgot to leave an offering for your ancestors, you might find your saddle mysteriously missing and your horse giving you side eye. Spiritual fear was real. You didn't just worry about dying, you worried about dying wrong. What if your soul got lost? What if your ancestors were busy and didn't pick up your afterlife call? What if you ended up haunting the wrong yurt? And let's not forget the dreams. Mongols took dreams very seriously. You dreamed of a white fox. That could mean good fortune. You dreamed of a black crow. Bad omen. You dreamed of your horse, speaking in riddles and demanding a raise. Time to cut back on the fermented mare's milk. Every twitch of the wind, every oddly behaving goat, every suspiciously shaped cloud could be a message from the spirit world. Or just the weather being dramatic again. Survival wasn't just about dodging arrows and remembering where you buried your emergency cheese. It was about navigating a world where the physical and spiritual realms were constantly eavesdropping on each other. You had to be tough, yes, but also respectful. You didn't spit near sacred trees. You didn't mock the wind. And you definitely didn't joke about the ancestors, unless you wanted your stew to mysteriously curdle for a week. And then there was the food. Oh, the food. You ate what you had when you had it, and you were grateful. Dried meat, curdled milk, and something that might have once been a root vegetable, but now resembled a fossilized boot. You didn't complain. You chewed. You smiled. You told yourself it was earthy. Because complaining might offend the spirits, and no one wanted to be the guy who got haunted by a lactose-intolerant ghost. So yes, life was hard. But it was also deeply spiritual, weirdly poetic, and occasionally hilarious in a laugh or cry kind of way. You lived with one foot in the material world and the other in the mystical, hoping neither foot stepped in something unpleasant. Between harsh weather, brutal laws, constant riding, a harsh diet, and violent conquests, life in the Mongol Empire was a world of survival, not comfort. Because when your pillow is a saddlebag, and your bedtime story is a cautionary tale about disobedience, you learn to sleep with one eye open, and your boots on. Comfort was a foreign concept. Mongol life wasn't about plush cushions and scented candles. It was about windburn, saddle sores, and the constant hum of, "Please don't let me be the example today." You didn't wake up to birdsong. You woke up to the sound of your commander yelling, "We ride in 10 minutes," while your horse gave you a look that said, "Again." The weather alone could have been classified as an enemy combatant. Summers scorched, winters froze, and spring was just a muddy prank played by the gods. You'd ride through blizzards so cold your eyebrows froze mid-expression, then gallop into deserts where your sweat evaporated before it even had the decency to drip. And through it all, you were expected to smile, nod, and keep riding like your saddle was made of clouds instead of regret. The diet. Let's just say it was less culinary delight and more whatever hasn't run away yet. Dried meat, fermented milk, and the occasional mystery stew were staples. If it was edible and didn't bite back too hard, it went in the pot. And if you complained, well, you could always eat your words, lightly salted with tears. And then there were the conquests. You didn't just live in the Mongol Empire, you conquered in it. Peace was a temporary pause between campaigns, and downtime was just a chance to sharpen your weapons and practice your war cries. You didn't get to say, "I'm not really a morning person." You got up, mounted up, and hoped today wasn't the day you became a footnote in someone else's victory song. It was a life of grit, discipline, and the kind of resilience that made lesser empires weep into their silk robes. You didn't survive because you were lucky. You survived because you were ready. You would be expected to fight, ride, and obey without hesitation. Because in a world where hesitation meant decapitation, enthusiasm wasn't optional. It was mandatory. In the Mongol Empire, the phrase, "I'll think about it," was a great way to become a historical footnote. Orders weren't suggestions. They were divine mandates delivered by someone with a sword and very little patience. You didn't ask why, you asked how fast, how far, and should I bring snacks? Obedience was the glue that held the whole terrifyingly efficient war machine together. If your commander said, "Charge," you charged. If he said, "Retreat," you retreated, ideally in the same direction as everyone else. If he said, "Pretend to retreat," then ambush them from behind. You did it with the kind of synchronized flair that would make a marching band weep. And it wasn't just about following orders. It was about doing so with gusto. You didn't just ride into battle. You launched yourself into it like a caffeinated thunderbolt. You didn't just hold the line. You became the line, preferably while yelling something inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. Mongol warriors were expected to be fast, fearless, and frighteningly efficient. If you hesitated, you weren't just slowing down the unit. You were inviting disaster, dishonor, and possibly a very awkward conversation with your ancestors in the afterlife. Training for this level of obedience started early. Mongol children learned to ride before they could walk, shoot arrows before they could spell, and follow orders before they could pronounce them. By the time they were teenagers, they could hit a target at full gallop, while reciting their family lineage and dodging incoming insults from their older siblings. And the discipline. Oh, it was intense. You didn't just get a slap on the wrist for disobedience. You got a permanent vacation from breathing. The Mongol military didn't tolerate freelancing. You were part of a unit, a system, a terrifyingly well-oiled machine that didn't have room for improvisation unless it was strategically approved improvisation with a backup plan, an assigned permission slip from your commander. But even if you did everything right, fought bravely, rode swiftly, obeyed flawlessly, there was no guarantee of peace, safety, or even a decent night's sleep. A single mistake could cost your life, and even victory brought little peace. Because when your reward for surviving battle is another battle, you start to wonder if retirement is just a myth told to horses. In the Mongol Empire, there was no such thing as coasting. You didn't get to bask in the glory of a hard-won victory, sip some fermented mare's milk, and hang up your bow with a satisfied sigh. No, you patched your wounds, fed your horse, and waited for the next horn blast that meant someone else needed conquering. Victory wasn't a finish line, it was a pit stop. And mistakes. Oh, they were spectacularly unforgiving. You zigged when you should have zagied. That's a spear to the ribs. Forgot to secure your saddle properly. Enjoy your impromptu flying lesson, followed by a very judgmental funeral. Misread an omen. Misfired an arrow, mispronounced your commander's name. Congratulations. You've just become a cautionary tale, told around the campfire with dramatic reenactments and sound effects. Even the best warriors walked a tightrope over a pit of consequences. You could be a hero one day and a headless example the next. The Mongol command structure didn't hand out gold stars for effort. You either performed flawlessly or you were replaced. Sometimes by the guy who just helped bury you. And let's talk about the peace that followed victory. Spoiler, there wasn't any. After a successful campaign, you didn't get a vacation, you got reassigned.
Great job raising that city!
Now go raise that one. And take this flaming goat as a morale booster. The empire was always expanding, always hungry, and always one step away from turning on itself. Internal rivalries, succession disputes, and the occasional oops. We accidentally invaded the wrong province, kept everyone on edge. Even downtime was suspicious. If things were quiet, you didn't relax. You got nervous, because quiet meant plotting. Quiet meant someone was sharpening a blade and practicing there. I swear, I didn't mean to overthrow you. Speech. You slept with one eye open, one hand on your sword, and one ear tuned to the sound of betrayal galloping in from the east. So yes, you could win. You could survive. You could even thrive for a while. But peace, that was a luxury for poets and ghosts. In the Mongol Empire, the only true rest came when you were too dead to be useful. This is why you wouldn't last a day in the Mongol Empire. Because unless you enjoy sand in your teeth, blood on your boots, and the constant threat of being replaced by your cousin with better aim, you might want to stick to documentaries. Life on the steppe wasn't for the faint of heart, or the faint of hygiene. It was a relentless cycle of riding, raiding, rationing, and regretting your decision to skip shaman school. You didn't get PTO, you got PTSD. Your mattress was a saddle, your alarm clock was a war horn, and your co-workers were armed and emotionally repressed. You'd wake up to the sound of hooves, eat something that tasted like boiled leathers, because it was, and spend your day either preparing for battle or recovering from one. Your hobbies included arrow, fletching horse, whispering, and trying not to offend the wind. Your therapist was a shaman who prescribed chanting and goat bones. Your HR department was a guy named Batu, who once solved a workplace dispute with a lance. And even if you did everything right, rode fast, fought hard, obeyed orders, and remembered to thank your ancestors, you still weren't safe, because the Mongol Empire didn't run on comfort. It ran on conquest, discipline, and the kind of fear that made you flinch when a bird flew overhead the wrong way. So unless you're ready to gallop 100 miles a day, drink your dairy fermented, and sleep with one eye open, and the other watching for omens, it's probably best to admire the Mongol Empire from a safe distance, like, say, your couch. Disclaimer: while we strive to stay rooted in historical accuracy, we also use humor, exaggeration, and a healthy dose of sarcasm to make the past more engaging. The Mongol Empire was vast, complex, and often brutal, but we believe history can be both informative and entertaining. These long, funny, and calm narrations are designed to be enjoyed slowly, whether you're drifting off to sleep, working on a project, or just need a background voice that occasionally yells about goat-based justice. Thanks for riding with us across the steppe.